it's your favorite NPC and welcome to this ultimate crash course that will turn you from a React beginner to a full stack programmer, including React and Firebase. By the end of this course, you will be able to build full stack applications on your own, including register, login, logout, storing data, and so on. I'll explain everything to you that actually matters. Components, state management, how to handle events, styling, hooks, navigation, context, Firebase, and a lot more. So let's get started, guys. React is a free open source JavaScript library for building fast, interactive user interfaces using reusable components. It was created by Jordan Walk, a software engineer at Facebook. First used internally on Facebook's newsfeed, it was open sourced in 2013. It's maintained by Meta and has a huge community of developers. React powers the front end of massive apps like Facebook, Instagram, Netflix, Airbnb, and millions of others. Instead of writing massive files, React lets you build your application from small, reusable pieces called components. You then combine those components over and over again until you have a production-ready application. So why should you learn it? First, high demand and popularity. In 2025, React is still the king of front-end development, used by over 40% of professional developers and powered by millions of websites. If you want to increase your chances of landing a job, for example, React is definitely the way to go. In addition, React apps are a lot faster than normal static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript websites. Navigating within pages happens instantly, updating parts of your page is a lot faster and more efficient in general. Therefore, React improves the user experience drastically. So whether you care about yourself or your potential users and customers, React is the way to go. Installing React.js is super easy and works within a minute. Ideally, we install a code editor, which makes coding with React a lot easier. We also need to install Node.js on our system. Together with Node.js comes the Node Package Manager, which allows us to install different packages. We then use the Node Package Manager, also called npm, to install Vite, a modern build tool that helps us to create a React app by only writing a single line of code. So let's do it, guys. Let's start by getting the Node Package Manager. So let's type Node.js into the search bar, click on the first link right here, and right here you can just press Get Node.js. Right here you can now select the operating system you have. I'm going to select Windows because I have a Windows computer, Windows installer right here. We are going to wait for this right here to finish. Once done, we can just click on the MSI right here, and this is going to open the installer right here. This should open the setup wizard right here. You can just press next. I accept the terms in the license agreements. Next. Path right here should be fine. So next. This here is okay as well. So next. Let's press next and install right here. This will take a short time. And once done, you can just press finish right here. Now let's open the terminal. On Windows, you can just enter cmd right here and open the command prompt. This should open a terminal, and now we can check whether the installation has worked by just typing node -v for node version. And now you should see your current node version if the installation has been successful. You can also do npm -v to see whether the npm package manager has been installed. Now that you know that the installation has been successful, we can create our first React app by typing npm create vite at latest. And now we can just choose a project name for our project. And this can be anything you like. I'm just going to say first-app. Let's press enter. If this is your first time, this might ask you to install Vite. If that is the case, you can just press Y and enter. Otherwise, it's going to prompt you to select a framework. We are, of course, going to select React right here. You can choose a variant right here. TypeScript would be fine, but we are going to choose JavaScript in this course. You can select no right here and yes right here. And now this will install all of the necessary dependencies that you'll need for your React project. And once done, we will get this link right here. So now your React project is essentially set up. By pressing Ctrl and pressing this link, we can also open this link within our browser. And you will see this right here is our first React project. We've installed this React project within this folder. So within our C users Gani folder in my case. If you want to create the React project within another folder, you can of course also do so. So let's press Ctrl C to exit right here. Now we have to enter Y to terminate the batch job. And now let's cd, so change directory to our desktop, for example. So now within my terminal, I'm currently on my desktop right here. And now I can create a project right here by again saying npm create read add latest, followed by the project name. And let's say this is React minus test. I'm going to press enter again. I have to select the framework. So React, JavaScript, no, yes. And this created this React REST folder right here. So I had a typo there. And you can see I have a couple of folders and a couple of files already. Now let's also get a code editor to open this folder and write our first code. So again, let's go back to Google, for example, and let's type in VS Code. So we're going to use VS Code to write our code. Just click on the first link. Right here, you can press download for Windows. We're again going to wait for this to finish. Once done, we can just press on the setup right here. This should open the setup window. I accept the agreement. Next. This is fine. You can press next. Install. And now we just have to wait for the installation to finish. Once done, we can just press finish and this should open up Visual Studio Code, so our code editor. This is what your code editor should look like. And now to open our project, let's just click on Explorer right here. You can either just select Open Folder right here, or we can go to our folder, to our React project, take the folder and drag it in right here. And this will open VS Code within our project. So now this right here is our project. And now we can open this React project by starting a new terminal. So terminal, new terminal. And this will open a terminal within our project folder. So within React REST right now. And we can start our React app by using npm run dev. And this will start the development server. And now we can see our page by clicking on this link right here. So let's control click this link right here. And this will open our app within our browser. And right here you can now see our app. Let's understand the basics of React. Once we installed the project, we can see that we have all of those files. But there are only a couple of files that are really important for us. One of them is the index.html as well as the source folder. If we take a look at the index.html, you can see that we only have this div with the ID root as well as a script that links our source main.jsx file. So you can see that we're linking this file right here. Let's take a look at that file. If we take a look at this file, you can see that we basically just have plain JavaScript right here. So document.getElement by ID root. So right here we are saying that we want to get this element from the index.html page instead of our main.jsx page. And as you can see, this here is a normal JavaScript method that is just provided by React. So essentially we are saying, get me the root element and render everything we have right here within the root element. And that is something that is important about React. A React app will seem like a normal HTML page with a lot of pages, but in the end it's a single app application because everything we have inside of this project will be rendered within this single root element. So within this root right here, that is on our index.html page. And you will understand step by step how this works. So you don't need to understand everything just now. But just remember that we will render our entire app instead of this div that has the ID root. But that is something that we never have to touch. So that is something that you can remember, but it's not really important. All you have to remember is that this main.jsx is our entry file. So everything we have right here will be rendered within our page. And at the moment we are rendering our app component. So this is how a component looks. We will get to that later on. But right now we are just rendering this app.jsx as a component. If you're going to remove that one though and just going to enter a little bit of text, you can see that we're just getting the text right here. And right here I can just write normal HTML code as well. So I can say I want to create a div. And inside of this div I now have a text. So let's say text for example. I'm going to save and now you can see that we have text right here. And in React, you do not use HTML code, but you use JSX code. And that is just the name that they use for it. And a lot of people make this really, really complicated. But in the end, JSX is basically just HTML with a couple of add-ons. But you can write normal HTML code. So that is not really complicated. And the add-ons are basically just something that the React team has added that uses JavaScript under the hood to provide, for example, a couple of functions and so on that just make our life a little bit easier. An entire React application is essentially just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And the React framework just uses all of those things to make the life super easy for us. So now we can also go back to the previous version where we just added our app right here. So it is just possible to create a lot of different components or pages and render those pages or components within other pages and components. And we get to that later on. But right now we are just rendering our app right here. So we can go to our app right here and we can just remove everything we have right here. And we can also remove that. And right here we can delete everything as well because we do not need that anymore. If you now want to display something on this page, you can just use a div, for example, and write some code in here as well. So this works as well, but right now we're not seeing anything. And the reason for this is that you always need to return something to output it, like so. And as you can see, once we add the return statement, we are now getting that. If we want to get two divs next to each other, so something like this, for example, we will get an error because every single component in React can only return one single element. So it can return one div, for example. That is something that is valid. And now you can have a lot of different children within this component. So you could have a div within a div, and you could have another div, and another div, and so on. But you always have to have one single parent component for all of the other components. Now I could also use a paragraph right here. So that is valid. That's just normal HTML. I could also use an anchor tag right here. That one could have an href attribute, and so on. So all of this is valid within React. Something that is really important later on especially is that we can also write JavaScript code within JSX. To basically switch from HTML to JavaScript within JSX, we can just use those brackets. And instead of those brackets, we can now use normal JavaScript code. So we could, for example, say that we want a console.log whoppy, for example, for whatever reason. Now we're going to reload the page. Let's go to full screen and let's inspect. And if we go to the console, we can now see whoppy right here, as you can see. So right here we have whoppy. And that is something that is really, really useful because you can basically mix HTML and JavaScript code within JSX. And that is something that you will do a lot later on. So let me summarize all of this for you. Everything will be rendered within the root element of our index.html, but we never need to touch this index.html file. So even if you don't know that, that's not important. Instead of our main.jsx, we say that we want to render everything we defined right here instead of this root element. And now we specify all of the components essentially that we want to render within this root element. In our case, we only want to render our app component within this div at this point in time. So we're just saying that we render right here all of the things that we have defined within this app.jsx. So within this component. So we could also just go ahead and take this entire code and place this code right here. So replace our app component, and this would still have the exact same effect. Instead of a JSX file, we can just write normal JSX code, which is essentially JavaScript and HTML with a couple of add-ons provided by the React library. On a normal website, there is a representation of your entire page called the DOM, the Document Object Model. It's a tree that describes the whole structure of your page. When something updates, like when a user clicks a button, the browser may need to recalculate large parts of that tree. So positions, styles, layouts, all of it. React solves this by using the virtual DOM. The virtual DOM is basically a copy of the real DOM. Whenever the user interacts with your page and something changes, React updates the virtual DOM first, compares it to the previous version, and figures out the minimal set of changes necessary. It then applies only those tiny updates to the real DOM. This makes the whole process much faster and far more efficient. Let's understand components in React. So what is a component? In order to understand components, let's take a look at YouTube, because YouTube is something that could, for example, use components. So let's take a look at it. What is a component? A component can basically be everything. So this entire page could be a component, for example. So everything that is rendered on this page belongs to one single component. Now you could, for example, further divide this single component into multiple other components. For example, you could say that this header right here, that includes the search bar and everything else, is one component, and that this body right here is the second component. So this is a component and this is a component. And sorry for the bad drawing, but I hope you get the idea. Now we could further divide this header, for example, and this body into components. So let's, for example, say that this sidebar is a component to the left and everything to the right is also a component. And now you could further divide this. You could say that this here is a section, for example, this here is a section, this is a section, and this is a section, and so on. So you could further divide this into subcomponents. And now again, you can subdivide this component, for example, into multiple other components. So all of those things can be components, for example. And if you take a look at those components, for example, they all have the exact same style. They all have a button, they all have a text. The only difference is that there might be a slightly different image and a slightly different text, but the structure is the exact same. So it is possible within React to define one of those components, for example, once, one single time, and then reuse this component over and over again with just a couple of subtle changes. So maybe just changes for the image as well as the text. And this right here, if you take a look at this, you could turn this into a component as well. So this right here could be a basic component. So this right here could be a component that you reuse over and over again instead of another component that you reuse over and over again. So this entire section is a component where you only change the image, for example, depending on the input that you might get from somewhere, in our case that you might get from the database. And that component might consist of an image, a title, a channel name, for example, as well as an upload date. So you get the idea already. When you think that you might want to reuse something, it might make sense to create a component, because maybe you want to have this exact same structure hundreds of times, and then writing the HTML code 100 times is not really efficient. So you can define the HTML structure once and then use it over and over again. And I really hope you get the idea, but we'll take a look at this right now anyways. Let's see how we can do that inside of React. So imagine we want to have an input element right here multiple times, for example. So we can of course say that we just want to create an input of type text, and then we can just duplicate that one a couple of times. And now we have those input fields right here. But now we can also replace this input with a component inside of JSX. So let's just remove that one. Let's create a component that might have the name input.jsx. And this right here is just a normal JSX file. And we can create a component by using the function keyword followed by the name of the component. Usually the name of the component is the same name as the file name, so input. Now we can accept parameters right here, so this is just a normal function, and we have the body right here. Instead of the body, we can now just again use a return keyword, and we can, for example, return an input of type text, for example. If you take a look at our app.jsx, we are also exporting our app right here. So in order to use a component within another component, you first have to export that component. So you could, for example, export default app, or in our case, we can say export default input to export our input component. And now if we want to use this component on another page, we can say that we want to import this component. So we say import input from ./input. So now we imported this component and we can use this component instead of this app component right here as well. So we can say input, and this can be a self-closing tag. So a component can usually be a self-closing tag, and you can call a component like this, or you can incorporate a component like this. And now if you wanted to use the exact same component a couple of times, you could do something like this. But now let's imagine our input component should always have a corresponding body. So we can just use div right here. Then we add our input right here, and we add a button right below that, for example, says button. And as you can see, now every single component right here consists of an input field and a button. But obviously this would be something that is not that good in React. So what we can also do is we can just go ahead, create a second component, say this here is going to be the button.jsx component. We can again use a function, but I also want to show you a different syntax to achieve the exact same result. So we can also say const button, so this is going to be a variable, and that one is going to be equal to an arrow function. So I can use the normal function syntax, but you can also use the arrow function syntax to create a component. And this is just the normal JavaScript function essentially. So we use the normal JavaScript syntax right here, and then we're going to return a button, for example. So a normal HTML button that has a text of button, for example. It doesn't really matter too much. And now again, we can say export default button, like so. And this has to be button. And now, of course, we could go to our app.jsx and we could render input button. And if we just press enter, VS Code will automatically import this button element. So as you can see, import button from ./button will be added automatically on top once I press enter, /close to close the button component. And as you can see now, I created a button component, and I can again reuse this button component as often as I like. But maybe now I have an input button component that should always display an input combined with a button. So let's create input button.jsx, and now we can just say const input button is equal to an arrow function, and that one is just going to return, let's say, a div, And instead of this div, we are going to use our input from ./input. So we'll import that one right here, and our button from ./button. And as you can see, now we have this input button. And now let's also export our input button. So we can say export default input button, like so. Whoops, like so. And now we exported that one. And now we can also, instead of our app.jsx, use our input button right here. And this now includes an input and a button, always combined. So now I only need one single component to output all of this code. And obviously this is a super minimalistic example, but you can think about something like YouTube, for example, where components grow and grow and grow. And you might want to combine a lot of components to one single component. So maybe this here is a video card that consists maybe of an image component, a profile component, a title component, channel component, and so on. So I think you get the idea. It's really easy to create complex components by combining the small building blocks to more complex building blocks. And that is the entire concept of React. You have components, you combine those components and create a more complex component that you can reuse over and over again. So instead of having to retype the code over and over again, you just use different components. And obviously those components at this point are super static. So every single button in our case has the same text, every single input has the same placeholder, and so on. But we later on learn how we can change that. Now let me also show you the difference between export default and a named export. So there exists a default export. That one is the export that we've already seen. And that one allows us to export one single thing from every single file. So if we would have a second function inside of this file, maybe app1, we could not say that we want to export default app and we want to export default app1 like so. This here is an error because every single file can only have one default export, which also makes sense because once you import this somewhere else, for example in your main.jsx, you do it like this. So you say app from, and then you just define the path. This here could also have another name. So this could be app12, for example, and then we just would have to use app12. So this would work as well. So you can also rename the file right here if you wanted to. But if you use a named export, that is something that is not possible because you have multiple exports. So you could, for example, say that this here should be a named export, so app, and we also want to export app1. And obviously we need the exact same names when importing them, because now that we have more than just one export, it is not really clear without the proper name which imported property belongs to which exported property. So we need to use the exact same names. And if you take a look at this, you already see how the syntax works. You have those curly brackets right here, followed by the exact names of the things you want to import. So in our case, it might be app, and it might be app1, for example, like so. So as you can see, now we can import those components, but one thing is also necessary. So we have to remove the default right here. So we can just say export, followed by the name of the components we want to export. And then we can import those components wherever we want by using this syntax right here. And you could also just go ahead, remove all of this right here and just say export function app1 and export function app. So now we are exporting our app and our app1 as a named export. So this here still works. But usually for a component, you want to use a default export. So what you usually do is you just go ahead and say export default app, for example. So this is what you will see most of the times. But it's important that you understand how this works because as you can see, under the hood, React also uses a lot of named exports, and we will use a lot of named exports throughout this entire series. So all you really have to remember is that each file can only have one single default export. If you want to import something that has been exported by using the default export, it works like this, without brackets. A file can have multiple named exports. If you want to import something that is a named export, you use those curly brackets right here. But since we use Visual Studio Code, it's super easy anyways, because we can just press enter and it will automatically, most of the times, import the right thing for us. So let's say we would not have this right here imported. I can just go inside of VS Code and type input button, for example. And as you can see, I'm already getting a suggestion by VS Code that shows me the path. If I'm going to press enter, it will automatically add the input to the top of our file. And most of the times this will just work fine. Let's understand hooks in React. First of all, let's delete everything we had last time, like so. Let's just return a div, and instead of this div, we are having an input field of type text, for example. Doesn't really matter too much though. To understand a hook, let's first import it. So how can we import a hook? We can import a hook by saying import followed by the name of the hook. In our case, let's take a look at the useState hook, because that one is the simplest one and also the most important one. After the named import right here, we have a from, followed by the name of the library we want to import from, and in our case we want to import from React. Usually every single hook starts with a use, so useState, useContext, useEffect, and so on. In our case, again, we want to use useState. So what exactly is a hook? A lot of people make this really complicated, but essentially a hook is just a function that the React team wrote for us that makes our life a little bit simpler. So if you're going to write a function, for example, that has the name use whatever, and then is going to be equal to a certain function, this takes a param, for example, whatsoever, so a name, doesn't really matter, could be anything, and then you're going to do something right here, then you have pretty much already what a hook is. So the React team just wrote a function for us that is going to do a specific task for us. And in our case, one of the hooks is the useState hook. Let me show you how this one works. We can say that we want to have const email and set email, and this one is going to be equal to useState. Let's use those quotation marks right here, and now let me explain how this works. And we need to call that one inside of our app, like so. So this right here is normal array destructuring. So you will see this syntax in pretty much every single React project. Let me explain array destructuring very quick so we are all on the same page. So if you have an array, for example, that has the name r, for example, and is going to be equal to 10, 20, 30, then we can get the individual values from this array by saying const, followed by this syntax, followed by 3 variable names. So this could be 1, 2, 3, and this is going to be equal to r, like so. So this syntax just means take whatever you have inside of this array, in this case, and destructure it. So place the first value inside of the variable 1, the second value inside of the variable 2, and the third value in the variable 3. So you basically just take an array and turn that one into individual variables. And that is exactly what is happening right here. So the React team wrote this useState hook right here and said that this useState hook is basically going to return 2 values. And those 2 values are encapsulated inside of an array. And now we can give those 2 values whatever name we want. And in our case, we said that the name should be email and set email. It could also be username, for example, and set username. Or it could also be this and this. Doesn't really matter. So it could be pretty much anything. But usually it might make sense to have a descriptive name right here. And those values that the React team decided to return for us is usually a value and a function to set this value. So this right here is going to hold the value, and this function allows us to set this value. And only this function allows us to set this value. So email is equal to whatever will not work. If we want to set the email to a certain value, then we have to use set email followed by the value, so wayo, for example. So now by using set email, we said that the email, so our email is going to be equal to wayo in this case. So this is just the way React handles this stuff. That is something that you just have to remember. And now usually you use the useState hook to store the value of an input field somewhere. If you take a look at this now seems to work, but there's no way that we know what this value is. So we somehow need to keep track of this value. And we can do so by saying that our value is going to be equal to our email, like so. Now, if I'm going to type something in though, and I'm typing right now, nothing is happening. And the reason for this is that our email is always just an empty string, because that is our initial value. Also, you're going to use a hook by using the hook name, followed by those brackets, and inside of those brackets you can define a default value, and it might make sense to initialize an email with an empty string. But you could also say hey. And as you can see now we have hey inside of this input field, because our input field value is equal to our email, and we initialize our email with hey. But it might make more sense to use an empty string. Now if we want to set the value of an input field, React offers us the onChange property for every single input element. And right here, React will give us an event, and we can define a function right here that will be executed on every single keystroke. So every single time we type something, this function right here will be executed. And now let's say that I want to set the email to a certain value once we type something. So let's just say I'm going to set our email to hey. Let me save that. And once I'm going to write anything in here, so an A for example, you can see that we're getting hey. Because right now we're always setting our email to hey. But we can fix that problem by saying that we want to set our email to our e. This is going to be an event, dot target dot value. So this is just something that you have to remember. E is an object that holds the target property, that holds another object, the target object to be precise, and that target object has the value property. Let me save that one, and now we can just type some text in, and as you can see now this works. But if I'm going to console.log our email, for example, you will see that we are now updating our email, so we can keep track of our email. And if I'm going to type something in here, you can see that we're getting the input inside of the console. So email now seems to work. But let me also show you the e object, so the event object, by doing console.log of e on every single keystroke. And I'm going to remove this console.log statement right here. Let me reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting this object. This object, this event object, has the target property, as you can see. And instead of this target property, which is also an object again, we have this value property. So e.target.value will always give us the value inside of React. But this does not just work for an email. So you could also say const username, set username is going to be equal to useState, and we can initialize that one with an empty string again. Again, we are going to create an input field of type text. We have to set the value once again to our username, and on change, we want to say that we want to set our username to e.target.value, like so. And it's as simple as that. And of course, you do not only have to define a string right here as the initial value, you could also use a number, for example. You could use a boolean, so true or false. You can also use null, so no value at all, and so on. But usually an email is obviously a string, so it might make sense to initialize the value with an empty string. So to sum up, a hook in React starts with the use keyword followed by the hook name. In our case, we use useState right here. useState is basically just a method from the React team. We should initialize it with our initial value. Right here, our initial value is an empty string. The first variable that we destructure will usually hold the value, whereas the second variable will usually be used to set the value of the first variable. Let's understand props in React. Last time we created a state to keep track of the values inside of our input fields and update the values. But now let's just delete everything and do everything from scratch, like so. Let's also delete our button and input.jsx, and let's create a new component. Let's say the component has the name input.jsx. We're going to create a basic component, so const input is going to be equal to an arrow function, and we're going to export default input like so. Right here, we are just going to return an input field of type text, for example. And if we are now going to render our input field right here, and we will have it 4 times, for example. We are getting an error because we did not wrap it inside of a wrapper element. So we need to return a div. We're going to have those input fields inside of this div. And now we're going to save. And you can see that we have 4 different input fields. But as you can see, all of those input fields look the exact same. And if I wanted to use a placeholder right here, for example, of email, doesn't matter, then every single input field right here has the placeholder text email. And that, of course, doesn't make too much sense. There needs to be the option to make all of the values right here customizable. And there is a way, and it's actually pretty simple. And the way is called props. And props are pretty similar to attributes in HTML. So if you think about an attribute inside of HTML, you can, for example, say that the source or the placeholder is going to be equal to something right here. So it doesn't really matter. And props are pretty much attributes inside of HTML with a cool add-on. So imagine we wanted to add the placeholder right here. So we can just say placeholder is going to be equal. And for the first one, maybe the placeholder is going to be equal to email. For the second input field, the placeholder should maybe be equal to username. And for the third input field, the placeholder might be equal to password. And let's just have random text right here. Doesn't matter. And now we're essentially passing all of those attributes, all of those props, as you name them in React, to the component right here. But how do we pass them right here? We are passing them as props, so we can accept them as a parameter right here. And now let me just console.log the props for you, so you really understand what is going on right here. Let's take a look. Let's inspect. Go to the console. Let me reload the page. And we're getting this object right here. So the props are essentially just an object that hold all of the necessary props that we defined right here. So the props object right here essentially just holds all of the attributes, if you want to think about it like that we defined right here. So if we define another attribute or another property right here, for example, whoopee, which is equal to 1, doesn't matter, you can see that we are now getting, for our first property, if I'm going to reload, placeholder of email and whoopee of 1. So this seems to work. So you can define as many properties right here as you want for every single input element, and therefore make this really customizable. And as you can imagine, now that we have the props right here, we can use the props to do pretty much anything. So we can, since this is a normal object, a normal JavaScript object, we can access this object by using the dot notation. So instead of hard coding placeholder right here, we can also say that we want to use JavaScript to dynamically input the value right here. How can we use JavaScript instead of JSX? We can use JavaScript by using those curly brackets. So now we are saying go from JSX code to JavaScript code. And now we're going to access props dot, what is the name? The name is placeholder, but we could also access whoopee. Doesn't matter, for the first one at least. So we are going to access placeholder. And as you can see now we have email, username, password, and random text. I could also say that I want to access props.whoopee, like so. And I'm only getting 1 for the first input field because only the first input field has a key of whoopee. The rest does not have this key and therefore you do not see anything. So props.placeholder might make a little more sense. But obviously you can also destructure the properties from this object. So you could say instead of props, you can also say placeholder and whoopee. And now instead of accessing props, you can just access the variables immediately like so. And this would still give us the exact same result. Let me also give you a short introduction to destructuring in case you might not understand, because that is something that is important. And it's pretty similar to array destructuring just for objects. If you have an object that can be a person, for example, and the person could have the name Jonas. So we have the object Jonas, which is a person. Jonas might have a name. And the name might be Jonas. Jonas might also have an age, and the age might be 24. So let's save that one. And now I might want to get the variables Jonas and age. So of course I could say I want to console.log Jonas.name. And now I could just reload the page, and as you can see we're getting Jonas in the console. So I'm able to console.log Jonas.name. But maybe I only need the name and I only need the age, and I do not always want to use the dot notation. So I can go ahead and destructure the object by saying const. Now I need to define the names of the keys. So name and age are the keys, followed by an equal sign. And now I need to define to the right the name of the object, which is going to be Jonas in our case. And by doing so, I'm saying, give me the values of name and age, so of the keys name and age inside of this object, and place them inside of the variables name and age. And I can also rename them if I wanted to username by using the colon right here. So now instead of saying Jonas.name, I can just say username, like so, because I renamed our name to username, like so. We're still getting Jonas in the console, as you can see. So let me reload. You can see it, it works. But let's not rename that one because that is something that you rarely ever do. And let's use name instead. So as you can see now, I'm console.logging the name, and I can also console.log the age if I wanted to. And as you can see now, we're getting Jonas and 24. So that is object destructuring. And we're doing the exact same right here because obviously props is an object as well that just looks like that. So we are having const props being equal to, and in our case, we had the placeholder property that stores the value of our placeholder. So whatever we defined right here, and whoopee. And obviously I can destructure this object as well. So I can just say placeholder and whoopee. And now I just took from this object the values for the corresponding keys and stored them. So stored the values inside of a variable that has the name placeholder and a variable that has the name whoopee. And obviously I could also rename that one if I wanted to, but that is nothing I really want to do. So that is how this works. The fact that this placeholder is going to be equal to this placeholder is just because this makes sense in this case. But I could also say that this is not a placeholder, but that is chopper. And chopper is equal to email, for example. And now I could destructure chopper, for example, like so. And now I could say that placeholder, let me delete that one, is going to be equal to chopper. I'm going to save the page, and now we're having email for the first field because we set chopper for the first field. We destructure chopper right here, and we set our placeholder equal to chopper. So whatever we have stored inside of this variable. But obviously placeholder makes a lot more sense, and whoopee does not make too much sense as well. I just want you to understand how this works. Now we can also define different values for every single input. So we can, for example, say that we want to create an email, set email, which is equal to useState. And that one is going to be an empty string in the beginning. Then we want to have, for example, a username, set username is equal to useState. Let's use an empty string as well. And let's just say we are going to delete the last one. That one is not really necessary. And for the third one, we will have a password, for example, and set password right here. And now we want to have different values for every single input element. So how can we do that? Obviously, we somehow need to pass the value to the HTML element right here. So we can just say value, but this can have any name essentially. This could also be VL, but value might make a little more sense. So value is in our case going to be equal to our email. The value for our username is going to be equal to our username, and the value for our password is going to be equal to password. And again, we are going to use those brackets right here because this in the end is just JavaScript code. So let me go ahead. Let's go into our input field, and for the value, we can just say that this value is going to be equal to our value, for example. So right now we have placeholder and value as properties for every single input. So we can destructure them. We can say we are going to destructure the placeholder and we are going to destructure the value. Our placeholder is going to be equal to our placeholder and our value is going to be equal to our value right here. And as you can see, now we have the placeholder and we have a value. And whatever I type in, I'm not getting a change right here because we did never define a non-change function. So what we can do in order to change that is we can use onChange right here. And now obviously, if we want to change the value right here, we would need to use the set email function for our email field. We would need to use set username for our username field and set password to our password field. So we could obviously say that set email is equal to set email. Set username is going to be equal to set username and so on. But that is obviously something that is pretty bad because now we have different property names for every single input field, even though the property names should obviously be the same since we're doing the exact same stuff. We're just updating the input field. So instead, we can just say that we want to set our value. This name, again, is up to us, of course. And we will set the value for the email field by using the set email function. We would set the value for the username field by using the set username function. And we will set the value for the password field by using the set password function. Let's save that one. And now, of course, we need to destructure this function right here as well, because that one is inside of our object now, inside of our prop object as well. So set value can be used right here instead of our onChange handler. So we just say we're getting an event again. And our set value function will set the value that we will get instead of e.target.value. So let me refresh the page. We're getting this effect, and this effect. And we are now able to enter the value. And now if we're going to go into our app.jsx right here, we can, for example, console.log our email. We can console.log our username. And let's take a look at that. So now if I'm going to enter something inside of our email, I'm getting this effect. If I'm going to write something into our username field, so username, I'm getting this inside of username. And as you can see, this is the email field, this is the username field. And now I could also log the password and so on. So now, even though I'm setting all of the values instead of this input component right here, so I'm setting them right here, I can access those values one component higher. So let me draw that for you so you really understand what is going on. So at the moment, we are having this component, the app component, and inside of this app component, so instead of this component, we are having access to our email, username, and password. So we can access email, username, and password, even though the input is essentially one level further down. So we are rendering the input right here 3 times. So we have 3 input fields. And even though we are changing the values inside of those input fields, so one level further down, we're able to access those values inside of our app component. And we could, for example, console.log them. We could use them for something else and so on. And that is something that makes React really powerful. So let's imagine, for example, we would have a profile page as well also one level down. So right next to those input elements. Now we could also pass the username, for example, to this profile page. And the profile page could now, for example, display the username as well, or the email or the password, doesn't really matter. So I think you get the idea. And let me also show you that this works. So we could create another component that can be our profile.jsx. We're going to say const profile is going to be equal to an arrow function right here. And we're just going to return a div that says profile at the moment. Now I'm going to export default profile like so we can use this profile instead of our app.jsx. And now I just want to render our profile on top of everything else like so. Now we're having this profile right here. But now maybe instead of this profile, I also want to use the username. So I can again pass the username as a property to our profile. So I can define a property name that is again up to me. And let me show you that pretty much anything works. This is going to be AO. And AO is going to be equal to my username, for example. Now I'm getting access to this AO property that is equal to our username instead of my profile.jsx. So I'm getting that one instead of the props object. I can again destructure the props object. So I can say I want to get AO. So this property right here from our app.jsx. So from this file. And now I can just say that I want to render AO instead of this div. And you can see that we are getting username right here, because that is what we've entered right here. But I could also, if I change that one, change AO, so the username essentially, that we're just displaying within our profile page. And by doing so, we're getting live updates instead of our profile, just by entering a random input. So we have essentially this parent component right here. So app is our parent component and is the parent component to our profile component and to our input component. We can pass props from top to bottom. So from the parent component to the child component, but it does not work the other way around. So we can take this email, pass it as a prop, one level down to our input element or to our profile element, or to be precise, to our component. We can use the property right there and, for example, output it or change it. If we're changing it, for example, then we're updating our variable right here. And since we're passing this variable to our input component and the profile component will also get the updates as well as the input component, and we're getting the changes in both of those components. So now let me again visualize what is going on right here. So we are having this app right here. And now we are just rendering the input components instead of our app component like this. And we're also rendering our profile component. But now let's say that we want to remove all of those components, all of the input components from here. And we just want to replace that one with an input handler component. So IH, for example. And instead of this input handler component, we are now having our individual inputs like this. So this is how this would look like then. So let me show you how this looks in a real app. We're just going to remove those input fields like so. And we're going to replace that one with an input handler. We don't have this input handler yet, so we can just say input handler.jsx. So this is just another component again, because everything in React is a component essentially. So const input handler is going to be equal to an arrow function again, and we're just going to return a div. And instead of this div, we are just going to have our input fields right here. So obviously we need to import those input fields. So I'm going to import input from ./input, and VS Code does the job for us. And now we need to export default input handler like so, handler like that. And now we can use the input handler right here. So input handler like that. And as you can see, the result now is pretty different because we're getting a lot of errors. And the reason for that is that we do not have those values right here. Obviously, our input field expects those values because it needs those values to display a placeholder, to display the value, and to set the value, so to change the email, the username, and the password. But there's no way we're getting this value right now. Let's again take a look at this graphic. We're having our app, but instead of the app, we are now having our input handler, and only instead of this input handler, we are rendering the individual inputs. So right here, we are passing our props, as you can see. And right here we are passing our props, but we are not passing our props from our app to our input handler. So the input handler does not really have those values, and is not able to keep passing those values to our individual input elements. So in order to fix that, obviously this is only one line at this point, but in order to fix that, we also need to pass our props now from our app component to our input handler component. And now that the input handler component has the values, it can now keep passing the values as props again to our individual input elements. And that is what we're going to do right now. So as you can see, instead of our input handler, we need our email and we need set email right here. So we can just say that we're going to destructure email and set email, for example. So we're again saying we're expecting email and set email as a property. Since we're saying that the key for our prop is set email and email, we also need to say that for the input handler, we have a property name of email that is going to be equal to our email in our case, and set email that is going to be equal to set email in our case. So as you can see, some of the errors are already gone, but we need to do the exact same for username, password, and set password. So we can say set username, set password, username, like so. So we're expecting all of those properties, so we need to set those properties again. And now, since we said that we are going to expect a property that has the name set password, the property name that we define right here needs to be set password as well, like so. So this cannot be some random stuff. If it is going to be some random stuff right here, then it would need to be some random stuff right here. And then it would also need to be some random stuff right here. So I hope you get the idea. But in our case, let's keep this clean and let's make this as you would do it in a real world application. So password is going to be equal to password. Username is going to be equal to username. Set username is going to be equal to set username. Set password is going to be equal to set password. So this right here is the property name. And this here is the actual method that we're passing to this property name. So this method right here. Let's save that one. We're getting this input handler. And now we're getting the exact same effect once again. And as you can see, this again seems to work. If I'm going to enter some input right here, we are seeing the exact same input inside of our profile. The only difference is that it now looks slightly different when you take a look at the architecture. But the principle is still the same. We're just passing props from one component to another. So from top to bottom. Again, you can only pass props from top to bottom, but you cannot pass them from bottom to top. So you could not say, let's create a value inside of our profile, pass it to our app, and now use it instead of our input handler. That is something that does not work. So if you know that the profile will need a property that will, for example, be created within our input handler or input, then we have to lift the state to a component that is parent to all of the other components. So if you imagine we are having email and set email instead of one of those input elements, and we know that we are now going to need it within the profile, then we would have to lift the state up to the parent component that is parent to both of those components. And that is what we call lifting the state up. But we'll have a lot of practice with that as well. And I know it can be confusing in the beginning, but we get there. Let's understand events in React. And we've already gotten to know one of the events, and we can take a look at that one really quick. So if we have an input field, for example, of type text, we could create a state, for example. So we can say that this input field is, for example, responsible for getting our username. So we have username and set username, which is going to be equal to useState. We are going to initialize the username with an empty string, like so. And now we are going to say that the value of our input field is equal to our username, like so. And the first event I want to show you is the onChange event. So onChange, like so. And as we've already seen, we are getting this e right here as a parameter from React. And we can, for example, say that we want to console.log this event, or we can just say that we want to set our username to e.target.value, like so. So this right here is the event object that we're getting. And we're using this event to set the username equal to the value. Now there also exists another important event, and that is the onClick event. If you think about a button, for example, that has a random text, maybe submit, for example, or maybe add, doesn't really matter. we can also add an event to this button, because in the end, an event is just when something happens. When a user enters some input, for example, when a user clicks a button, all of those things are events. And now we can react to this event, to this onClick event, for example, by adding onClick as a property, like so. And now we can pass a function, for example, to this onClick event. We could, for example, say const handle click is going to be equal to an arrow function. And we're just going to console.log clicked right here, like that. And now we're going to pass handle click to our onClick property, like so. Let me console.log that one. So let's open the console to see what we're console.logging, like so. Let me click. We're getting clicked, 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 and so on. So we're getting a lot of clicks right here. Now you can also do a lot more than just console.logging something. We could, of course, also pass a parameter right here. So we could say username. And now we just want to console.log our username. So the username that we passed right here. But as you can see, this right here will not work. And the reason for this is that we're saying that we want to execute the handle click function right here once we click on the button. But we also need a parameter. But right now we do not have a parameter right here. So we could obviously say that we're going to pass our username variable, this one right here, for example, to this function. And now once we click, we should get the username, but we're essentially not getting anything. And the reason for this is that onClick expects a function. It does not expect a function call. Every time you use the function name followed by brackets, you say you should execute this function right away, because this here is a function execution. We do not want to execute this function though once we load the page. We only want to execute the function once the user clicks on the button. So you have to pass a pointer to this function right here within the onClick property. You cannot pass the function execution in here. And this here is obviously a function execution. So in order to fix that one, we can define an arrow function like so. And this arrow function is now a function that will, when being executed, call the handle click function right here and pass the desired value as an argument. So essentially, we are solving this problem by just defining another function that will execute the necessary function once the user clicks on this button. And now if I'm going to click and I'm going to enter a username, you can see that we're getting the value right here in the console. And every time we click, we're getting the value. We could also say that we want to have a number, for example. We're going to store that number instead of our state again. So const number set number is going to be equal to use state. We're going to initialize with the value 0. So by default, number has the value 0. We now say that we want to const handle add, for example, and we just want to increment the number by 1 every time the user clicks on this number. So every time we click on a number, we want to do number plus 1, for example. Now we're going to pass handle add to the onClick property right here, and let's see whether this works. We're going to add, and we cannot see the value, so we should probably also, let's first of all remove that, and let's say console.log number add. And we're getting the value, but this is actually not really a good way to do it. So let me show you how you should usually do this. When you use the set function, you can always also pass a callback function right here as an argument. So you could get the previous value, and the name doesn't matter. This can be p, this can be prev, this can be previous, but usually you just use prev. And now we can say that we want to increment the previous value by 1. So now let me show you. Let's press add, and as you can see, we are also incrementing the value right here. So this seems to work. So prev will always hold the previous value, so the value that is right now stored within the variable, and then you can use the previous value to modify it in whatever way you like. And every set function within React will have this previous value for the callback function if you need that one and if you want to use that one. So if you use a setter, so if you use the set function, you can either just define the value straight away, or you can pass a callback function that accepts the previous value as a parameter. This will automatically be assigned by React, and then you can use the previous value in whatever way you want. So you could also say prev plus 10, for example. We're going to add, and as you can see, we're getting this effect. And that is something that is really important. Let me introduce you to component reloading in React. Let's imagine we are having a number right here, and this number is going to be equal to 0 in the beginning. Now we just want to display this number instead of this div, for example. So we can change to JavaScript code, and we just want to display the number right here. As you can see, we are seeing the number right here now. So now I'm also going to add a button. So this number will be inside of a paragraph, for example, like that. And there will be a button right below that says increment, for example. Now I'm going to add the onClick property to this button. And I'm just going to pass a function to this onClick property that is just going to increment the number by 1. Now I'm going to click increment, and as you can see, nothing is happening. So let me console.log the number for you. So console.log number. Let's take a look at this by going to inspect and going to the console. Let me increment, and as you can see, nothing is happening right now. If I'm saying number is equal to number plus 10, for example, let me save that one. I'm going to click, and as you can see, there's still nothing happening. And as you can see, we're already getting this error. So this is not correct in React. And why is that? A component only renders once in the beginning. So once you load the page, the entire component, so everything you see on the page, is going to render. But after that, it's never going to re-render by default. The only option to really get a re-render is if you use custom React functionalities. If you use normal JavaScript, this will not re-render the component. If you want a re-render, you always have to use a state, for example. So you could say that our number, set number, is going to be equal to useState. Our initial value is going to be 0. And now we can just say, onClick, we want to set our number to 10, for example. And now if I'm going to click this one, you can see that we're getting 10. We can also say, give me the previous number. And I'm going to increment the previous number by 1. Let me save that one. And now I'm going to increment, and we are always incrementing the number by 1, as you can see. And the reason that we're now seeing the difference is that the setNumber method in React causes a re-render of the component. So if you use this React functionality, you will render this component once you load this page. And afterwards, if you use something like useState and you want to set something using the setter function, then you're going to re-render the component again and update the component essentially. Using normal JavaScript will not update the component. The only thing that can update the component is therefore a React function like setState. Let's understand styling and CSS inside of React. First of all, to understand styling, let's for example create a paragraph right here that has a text right here. And let's also create an anchor tag right below that, for example, says click me. So we have two elements that we can target right now. Let me also make this a little bit bigger for you. Now, if you remember, we have this index.css file right here that defines a couple of base styles by default once we load a new project, as you can see. So styles for an H1, styles for a button, button hover, and so on. So let's just delete everything. And once I'm going to save this one, you see that we reset it or removed all of the styles. The reason for this is that we're loading this index.css file within our main.jsx file. And this main.jsx file is the entry point for our entire app. So we are rendering every single component in the end within this main.jsx file. So we will apply those styles from our index.css to every single component inside of our app. So if I'm, for example, going to define a style for our paragraph, so P, and I'm going to say font size is going to be 3 rems, you can see that I resized this text. Now I can also target every single anchor tag, and I can, for example, say that I want to have a background of green. I'm going to save this one, and as you can see, we are now having a green background. And I'm now going to create a second file, for example, about.jsx. I'm going to say const about is going to be equal to an arrow function. I'm just going to return, for example, another paragraph that says text from about. Now I'm going to export default about, so I'm exporting our about page, and I'm just going to render our about page within our main.jsx as well. So about like so, I'm going to import that one, and now you can see right here we're having the text from about, and right here we're having the text from our app.jsx. And as you can see, those styles from our index.css will be applied to every single component. And in this case, it does not matter whether we directly render this about.jsx or this about component within our main.jsx, or whether we render this about.jsx within our main.jsx. So if I'm going to say about right here, so I'm importing the about component and rendering the about component within our app.jsx. Even if we are rendering this about component within this app component, the app component will ultimately be rendered within this main.jsx, and therefore this about.jsx or this about component will also be rendered within this main.jsx, just one or a couple levels further down. So that does not matter. So whatever file you load within the main.jsx will be used as a style shield and can be used as a style sheet to define general styles for your entire app. So if you need to define general styles for your entire app, I recommend you to create one global file within your main.jsx, and then you can create some basic styles like this. Now, if you only want to have some styles that apply to a single component, for example, so maybe I want to create some styles that only apply to this about.jsx, then you can do that as well by creating a file, a module file, that can, for example, have the name about. Now, it's really important that you use a dot followed by module, because by doing so, you define a module followed by .css. So you always need this .module.css to define a module. Now, if I want to use a module and I want to use the styles later on, I need to define a class. So I can, for example, define a .text class. And let's say our text should have a font size of 1 rem, a color of black, and a background of yellow, for example. Let's save this one. And now we need to use this class that we created instead of our about.module.css within our about.jsx. In order to do so, you first need to import those styles as an object. So we can get all of those styles within an object, and usually we can just name this object styles. So we're going to say import styles from where do we want to import the styles? We want to get them from our about.module.css, so /about.module.css, like so. So now we imported those styles, but we still can't see a difference. And the reason for this is that we are having the styles object, and we need to use the styles object to define styles for this paragraph. So let me first of all show the styles object to you by console.logging that one. Let's go to our console. And inside of the console, you can see that we're getting this object right here. And this object has the text key value pair, so the text property. If I'm now going to define a second class, so maybe .text2, for example, and I'm just going to say color is going to be yellow for that one, and I'm going to save that one, you can see that we're now getting a new object, and this new object now holds text and text2. So this object, the styles object, will hold all of the classes defined within our module inside of an object, and now we can access those styles by using the dot notation. So we can, for example, say that the class name for our paragraph, now we need to switch over to JavaScript because we're accessing this as an object, and we want to access styles dot, what do we want to access? We could, for example, access text1, so text, or text2. And in our case, let's say we want to access text right here. And now you can see that this text here has a yellow background, black text, and only a font size of 1 rem. And now let's also create a second paragraph. So let's duplicate that one, and let's say this one has the class text2, for example. And now this text right here has the styles from text2. So usually when you create a module, you define everything as a class within your module, and then you can import all of the classes inside of an object within your page as a styles object. And then, of course, you can access all of the styles by saying styles dot followed by the class name. To summarize, usually you can create one global style sheet. Most of the time it will have the name index.css that you import within your main.jsx that can create some basic styles for your entire app, for example. And something that you do pretty often is, for example, resetting all of the styles within this file. So margin 0, for example, padding 0, and box sizing of border box. So that is something that you do pretty often. And if you want to create some specific styles for a single component, for example, then you usually create a module for this file and import all of the styles as a styles object. The reason that this global index.css file applies styles to every single subcomponent is that React, of course, is a single page application, because in the end we're rendering every single component within this root div right here. And of course, if we only have a single page, it makes sense that our index.css applies to every single subcomponent, because even though in React it seems to us as we are working with a lot of different components, in the end we're rendering all of those components on one single page. And of course, for one single page, you usually only need one single style sheet. And this, in this case, is this index.css. So if you want to use multiple style sheets for every single subcomponent, you have to use modules. At this point, you might have already seen the package.json file. And this file is somehow important because it lists all of your dependencies, dev dependencies, scripts, and so on. So as you can see inside of the package.json, we have a lot of general information like the name, the version, the type, and so on. And most of those things are not that important. But something that is definitely important is the dependencies section and the dev dependencies section. A dependency is something that your project needs in order to properly work. If you think about your computer, from time to time you also install programs, for example, and you use an installer to install a program. And a dependency is pretty much the exact same thing. You install a separate program that you need for your project to work. And we need the React installation and we need the React DOM installation. Those ones right here are dev dependencies, which means that you will only need those dependencies during development. Development is basically the phase within your project where you develop, so where you write your code, get the right images, and so on. And once you decide to release your app, so once you decide to make your app accessible for other people, you're usually getting your app to a server and so on. And that is then the production build. So you have development where you develop and you have production where you make your page accessible. And those dependencies are only necessary within development. So once you push this entire project into the production environment, so to your server, you will not need those dependencies anymore. But those dependencies right here, so the dependencies that are not dev dependencies, are necessary during development and during production. So if you want to, for example, play a game, then you have to install the game. And a React app is pretty similar. You have the project and you can do some things by default, but a lot of things are also not integrated into your project. So you might want to add dependencies. And other developers, for example, create dependencies and you can use those dependencies. And so, for example, someone created a dependency, so basically just a package, an installation that allows you, for example, to get data from the database, or that allows you to do routing within React, or that allows you to play a game, whatever, I don't really know. And then you can just go ahead and install the dependency within your project. And I want to show you how this works. So we can, for example, say React router DOM. Because that is a dependency, so an installation that you want to use pretty often within your React projects. And as you can see, we are now seeing right here npm React router DOM. So usually you want to use npm to install packages. What is npm? npm stands for Node Package Manager, and it's not really that hard to understand. It's basically just a program that allows you to install all of the other programs that you want or need to install. So npm is basically just the installer for all of the other programs. So now you can just, for example, copy this command right here, npm I, which stands for Node Package Manager, install, followed by the name of the package. And it always works like that. You always start, if you want to install something, with npm I, followed by the package name. And in our case, we want to use npm I React router DOM. So we can just copy that package. And now to install, we can create a new command prompt right here. And now I'm just going to press Ctrl V to insert. I'm going to press enter, and now we are just going to wait a short time. And as you can see under the hood, it's here installing all of the necessary packages, and it seems to work. And as you can see now, within our dependencies, we now have React router DOM followed by some random numbers. Let me also add another package. So npm I Axios. That one is a package that you might also want to use from time to time, because you can use that one to connect to a database. So a lot of people use Axios for this, but that's not really important at this point. Let's just press enter again. You can see we have to wait once again. We're installing all of the necessary packages, and now we have Axios right here. And as you can see, we also have a couple of numbers right here. And it's not really that important to understand what this means, but this here basically just defines the version number. The first number will change if you have a breaking change. If you have a breaking change, this means that the new version is most likely not compatible with the old version. So if you write your code within Axios 1 dot and you then upgrade Axios later on to 2 dot, your code might not work the same anymore. So those are breaking changes. Then for the second number, those ones are going to be minor changes. So with those changes, something might be a little bit different, but it will not break your current code. So it will still work. And the last number is a bug fix. So every time they find a bug, they're just going to fix that bug and increment the last number by 1. And that is essentially what this means. So basically it's just the version number. And you will see all of your dependencies right here listed within your package.json file. And where are the dependencies now? So where are the installed files? And all of the installed files, so all of the installed packages, are usually within your Node modules folder. Again, you do not have to touch the Node modules folder under normal circumstances. But you can see right here you have your Vite.js, Acorn, AJV, Axios right here, and so on. So all of your packages are within your Node modules folder. If you would now delete the Node modules folder, so completely move to the recycle bin, you could do that, and that is absolutely no problem. Why is that no problem? Because all the dependencies and dev dependencies are stored and defined within your package.json file. And now you can just use npm I, and this will take a look at your package.json file and install every single dependency defined within this package.json file once again. And as you can see, we're getting this Node modules folder once again. And the reason for this is that it's now going to install every single dependency once again. And that is really useful because if you think about pushing your project to GitHub, for example, you oftentimes have a .git ignore file. And actually, I do not have to create that one because we already have one. You obviously do not want to add your Node modules folder to your GitHub repository because the Node modules folder is usually super big. Uploading takes a lot of time, storing it within GitHub requires a lot of space, and downloading it later on also takes a lot of time. So you do not have to push the Node modules folder to your GitHub repository, but later on you can install all of the required dependencies anyways, because you have your package.json that defines all of the required dependencies, and you just have to use npm I to install all of the necessary dependencies within your Node modules folder. Let me introduce you to conditional rendering. Imagine we are having a normal number. So we are going to create a state that has the number and the setNumber method. useState is going to have an initial value of 0, for example. And now we, for example, want to render something if our number is below 10, and we want to render something else if our number is above 10. And there are two ways to achieve the exact same thing. And it's basically just normal JavaScript. Again, we have to switch to JavaScript, so we are using those brackets. Now we're going to check if our number is less than 10. We are just going to use a normal ternary operator. If our number is less than 10, then we want to output a div, for example, like so, that says less than 10. We're going to save that. Otherwise, so in that case, let's just copy that div. Let's paste it right behind that one. And let's say greater than 10. So if our number is less than 10, then we're going to output whatever we have right here after this question mark. So this is the normal ternary operator. Otherwise, so whatever we have after this colon will be outputted if our number is not less than 10. So in that case, we are going to output that div right here. Let's save that one. And as you can see, we're getting less than 10 because our number is less than 10. And if our number is now going to be 11, then we're going to output greater than 10. And we could, of course, have a button that is going to increment this number. So we could say button onClick setNumber. We're getting the previous number, and we are going to increment the previous value by 1 on every single button click. And again, since we're having arguments right here, we cannot pass the function like this, because right here, by using those brackets, we're again saying immediately call this function when rendering this component. And of course, we only want to call this function when the user clicks. So we need to pass this instead of the body of another function, like so. So now this works. And now we're having greater than 10, but let's initialize that one with 0 again. This button will have the text click, for example, doesn't matter. Now let's click that one a couple of times. And as you can see, now we're having greater than 10 once our number is going to be 11. We can also just display our number right here, like so. And now let's just try this again. And once we get to 10, we're having greater than 10. Obviously, this should be greater or equal to 10, but you get the idea. The second way to render something, depending on the condition, is the AND operator. And again, that is just normal JavaScript. So we have to change to JavaScript syntax again by using those brackets. And now we can say number greater than 10, for example, and then we can pass a div right here, like so. And let's say once we are greater than 10, then I want to render NPC codes, for example. Let me click this one a couple of times. And once we get to a number greater than 10, so to 11, for example, we are seeing NPC codes. And this works as follows. If the condition to the left is true, so if this condition is true, then we are going to render whatever we have to the right. And that is a pretty cool way in React to use the end operator. Let's understand how to render lists in React. In order to render a list, we first need to create a list. Let's create a list by using the state again. For example, we want to have our users and we have the setUsers function. This is going to be equal to useState, and we're going to initialize useState with an empty array. But now in our case, let's say we're not going to initialize it with an empty array, but we're instead going to initialize it with an array that has a couple of users already. So we can have a couple of objects inside of this array. And maybe every single object represents one user. So we can have a username, for example, for the first object, and that one is maybe equal to Jonas. And we can have an age for the first object, and that one is going to be equal to 27. Now I'm just going to copy this object maybe 2 more times, like so. And the second user might have the name Vinny and is 24. And the third user has the name Gabak and has the age 101. And now imagine I want to output all of the usernames and all of the ages right here. And that is something you want to do super often within React. Imagine you have a lot of blog posts, for example, and you just want to display blog post after blog post. Or you want to display a list of users that you get from the database. So this is a pretty realistic example as well. And again, we can use plain JavaScript to do that. And in our case, we're going to use the map method. So first of all, we change to JavaScript by using those brackets again. We're going to say users. So we're accessing this user's variable. And now we're going to call the map method. So that is a normal JavaScript method. Right here, we have to pass a callback function. And now this callback function will iterate or will execute a function for every single user. So we are getting one user for every single iteration. We can pass an arrow function right here. And now whatever we define inside of the body will be executed for every single user. Since we're using React, we need to return something. And we can, for example, return a div right here, like so, for every single user, and just output heyo. Let's save that one, and as you can see, we're getting heyo 3 times. And the reason for this is that this function will just go over this entire users array. User will store one of the users for every single iteration, so it's going to take the first user, store the first user in the user variable, and then it's going to execute this code. It finished the execution, so it's now going to take the second user, store it in the user variable, and execute the entire code again. So this body right here again. It's finished executing, so it takes the third user, does the same again. Now it wants to go on to the fourth user. There does not exist the fourth user, so it's going to break out of the loop essentially. So of course, since we're getting the user right here for every single iteration, we can now also access the key value pair, so the properties inside of every single object. So this is an object, and of course we can say user.username to access the username. We can also access the age by saying user.age, and we can just display that one here as well. So again, we need to change to JavaScript syntax because previously we changed to basically HTML. So we need to change to JavaScript once again because we're now accessing an object, and we can access user.username, as I said, like so. And now we're getting Jonas, Winnie, and Gabak. And we can also put everything into a wrapper div again, like so. And now we can have one div inside of this wrapper div for the username and one div for the age. And again, this is pretty similar to a component. Right here, you can only return one individual parent element. There needs to be a hierarchy. So one parent element, and then you can have as many children as you want inside of this parent element. But there needs to be one parent element. That's why I'm using a div as a wrapper. Let me save that one. And now we're getting username followed by the age. Also, at this point in time, if we go to the console right here and press inspect, you will see that we are getting this error. Each child in the list should have a unique key prop. So what does this mean? Right now, you can see that we are going over this user right here, and we are rendering this div every single time. So this is the parent element. The problem right now is that to React, all of these parent elements look the exact same. So this div essentially that calls Jonas 27, and this div that holds Vinny and 24, and this div that holds Gabak and 101 looks the exact same to React. So React wants something like a key. So if you think about a door, every single key is going to be unique. And since you have a unique key, it might be possible to identify the door. And the same goes for React. If you have a unique key for every single parent element, it's now possible for React to uniquely identify each component. And that is a concept that is super important within React, because later on you might want to delete, for example, within the map method, and without a key you of course couldn't target this component anymore. Maybe I want to delete the user that has the ID 505. But if I have 1000 users and none of those users has an ID, I cannot say who's the user with the ID 101. And most of the times you will have a unique ID. Oftentimes, if you work with a database provided by the database, and then you can use that one as a key and pass that one to the key property that we have right here. We're again going to switch to JavaScript, and now we can pass a unique ID like user.username. If we decide that this username in our database is going to be unique, this right here would be valid. But again, as I said, in a real database, you will oftentimes get the ID and you will use the ID. So let's just simulate that one. So we have an ID of 1 for the first user. We have an ID of 2 for the second user. And we have an ID of 3 for the third user. So now our ID is unique as well. So let me just pass the ID as a key instead of the username, like so. We're going to reload the page. And as you can see, now we're not getting this error anymore that each child should have a unique key. Let's understand the useEffect hook. We've previously learned the useState hook, and now we want to add the useEffect hook because that one is really important as well. We can start by importing the useEffect hook by saying import useEffect. We're going to import the useEffect hook from React, as you can see. And now we're first of all going to create a variable by using the useState hook. So let's say we have a number, set number, this is going to be equal to useState, and we're going to initialize the value with the number 0, like so. For example, we are now just going to render the number inside of a div, like so. And now we're seeing the number right here. And maybe right below we are having a button, and this button just says click, and on click we want to increment this number by 1. So we can just pass a function right here that sets our number to prev plus 1, for example. So it just increments the previous value by 1 essentially. So now as you can see, we're updating the number. Now let's also add the useEffect hook. To use the useEffect hook, you use the useEffect keyword like so, followed by opening and closing brackets. So you're again just calling a function that the React team has created for us. And as you can see, this function expects a callback function. So we have to pass another function as the first argument, like so. And now let's just define a body right here. So we can just console.log whatever, for example. This doesn't really matter. Now we're going to save this one, and we can pass a second argument to our useEffect hook. And I'll explain that one in a second. But let me just show how this looks like. In the beginning, this is usually an empty array. And you will understand this array in a second. But let's first of all reload the page so we clear the console. And you can see that we're getting whatever right here inside of the console. Now if I'm going to click the button, as I already told you, on every single button click, the component is going to re-render because our setState hook right here will be executed. Therefore, the component is going to re-render in order to update the number right here. So let me show you. We are updating, but we're somehow not seeing whatever again in the console. So this seems to only work once we load the component initially. So once I load the page, the useEffect hook seems to get executed, but it does not seem to get executed ever after again. But if I'm going to pass the number in here, for example, I'm going to save that one, and I'm now going, let me reload the page so we have a clear console, and I'm now going to click, for example, we can see whatever on every single button click, as you can see. So the useEffect hook is actually really simple. This hook will run once when you load the page. So on the first render, the useEffect hook will run first. So right before this component will be rendered for the first time, we are going to run the useEffect hook. So this is really good to fetch data, for example. And if we do not pass anything to this array that we pass as the second argument, this useEffect hook will never ever run again. It will only run once in the beginning. If you want to re-execute this useEffect hook though, when something changes, then we have to pass something inside of this array. And if we say number, for example, then we will execute this useEffect hook every time our number changes. So once we use that number, this useEffect hook is going to run again and will therefore execute whatever we have inside of this body again. If we would also have something like number 2, for example, set number 2 number2, which is also going to be equal to useState, and we also initialize that one with 0. And we're now just going to duplicate this onClick function, so this onClick button, and we're now using the second button to set number2, for example. And the text is v2, so we can just see the difference. I can now increment number1, and I can increment number2 by pressing the button. So I can increment, let me clear the console, I can increment number1 by pressing click. I can increment number2 by pressing 2 right here. But as you can see, we're only seeing whatever when we click the first button. So when we increment number1. If I'm going to add number2 to the dependencies though, this useEffect hook will now also run or rerun every time when number2 changes. Let me show you. So now number2, whatever, number1, whatever, number2, whatever. So we're getting whatever over and over again. Every time one of the dependencies, as you call them in React, changes, we will rerun the useEffect hook. So useEffect, to summarize, will run once in the beginning. The code that will be executed will be passed as a callback function right here, and it will re-execute every time, every single time, when one of the dependencies that we have to pass as an array changes. Let me introduce you to fetching data from an API, for example, and how to handle the errors. In our case, we're just going to use a simple API that we can find online. We will use the create random user API. So right here, we have this random user generator, if you click on this link. And as you can see, every time I call this API, we are going to generate a random user. Here you also have the documentation, how to use it. And all we need to get a random user is we need to call this API. So this URL essentially. And I'm going to show you how this works. If I'm going to enter this link right here, and I'm going to press enter, you can see that we're getting a result. Instead of this result, we have a gender, that one is female right now, name, that includes a title, a first, a last, and so on, as well as location. So we get a result that includes all of the information about the user. I can reload this one again, and we're getting a different person right now. Now we have a male, now we have a female, now we have another male, and so on. So every time we call this API, so this endpoint, and an endpoint is essentially just a URL. This URL, so this endpoint will reply with a response. And this response, in this case, includes this object that contains a result right here. And if we take a look at the documentation, you can also see that this is what the result looks like. We're getting an object. As you can see, we're getting this object. This object results includes an array. And inside of this array, we have things like the gender, the name, and so on. So this is essentially just what we're getting right here. And now we can use normal JavaScript instead of React to fetch the data right here. And usually, when do you want to fetch data? Usually it might make sense to at least fetch data every time the user loads the page. So most of the time you will do something like useEffect. Now we're going to create the useEffect hook. As the first argument, again, we have to pass a callback function that will execute at least once. Depending on the dependencies, it might also be more than once. In our case, let's just have an empty array. So we will just call this function in the beginning when loading the page. So once loading the page, we will just fetch a new user. And in order to fetch something in JavaScript, we are just going to use the fetch method that is built into JavaScript. So just normal JavaScript again. This method expects an input. This input is a string that includes the URL. So this method will call this URL that we pass right here. So in our case, it's this https randomuser.me/API URL. And if this fetch request is successful, then it's going to return the data. So I'm going to save that one. And this URL again is just this URL that we called right here. So that we entered instead of our browser. And the data this is going to return is just the data that we're getting right here. So this is the exact same, just using code this time. Now, if you think about it though, you're sending a request to a server where this API, where this data is essentially generated and stored. If everything works, then you're getting a response from the server and you're getting the data therefore within the response. But if you think about it, this is something that takes time. So this is nothing that happens instantaneously. And if you use JavaScript, every time you do something that takes a little bit of time and you do not know how much time this is going to take, you want to use async and await. So now we have to await the result essentially. And we can store the result in a variable that has the name res for response, for example. But as you can see, we're already getting an error. Cannot use keyword await outside an async function. So in order to be able to await something, we need to say that this function is going to be async right here. But as you can see, we're getting an error. And the reason for this is that useEffect can never be asynchronous. So this is not allowed inside of React. Something that is allowed though is to define another function within the useEffect hook. So we can, for example, say that this function const get user data is going to be equal to an arrow function, and this arrow function now is going to be asynchronous. So this right here is in fact allowed. And now we can just say that our response is going to be equal to await fetch that data right here. And now it is possible to just call this function within the useEffect hook. So get user data. So that right here is absolutely valid. Whereas marking the callback function that we pass to the useEffect hook as async, so this is not valid. That is something that is not allowed. But that right here is completely fine within React. So every time you want to execute asynchronous code within React, you have to define another function within the useEffect hook, for example. And then you can just call that function later on like this. Now we're having the response, but at the moment, let me just console.log the response so you see what is going on. Let's go to our page. Let me inspect, and you can see in the console, once I'm reloading the page, we're getting the response right here. This includes the body, the headers, and so on. So this response object has a lot of data. But in order to really get the data sent within the response, we have to do one more step. So we can say that const result is going to be equal, or in our case, it's going to be our user. So const user is going to be equal to res.json. So we have to parse the body that we're getting right here, in order to get the data from this object. And as you can see, user is declared, but its value is never read. But right now, this is also not going to work. Let me just show you that that one does not work. So let's console.log our user right here. Whoops, user like so. Let me reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting a promise. So res.json, that is something that is asynchronous itself. And every time we have something that is asynchronous, so that takes some time to execute, and we do not know how much time exactly, we need to wait for it. So we need to await it essentially. So again, await res.json. And now this right here should work. So let's reload the page, and we're getting this as a result. And the result, as mentioned previously, is the result that we're getting right here as well. So the result is just an array in our case. So now user is an object. Instead of this object, we can, by using the dot notation, access the results. So user dot results, like so. Let me just log that one. Let me reload the page. So now we are having user dot results, which again is an array. Now we can access the first element within this array. So user dot results of 0, like so. Let me reload again. Now we're getting this object within this array. So I know this is something that's really confusing, but again, it's just accessing arrays and objects step by step. And now inside of this object, we can now access all of those properties again. Since this is an object, we can use dot notation. So we can use dot email, for example, to get the email within this object. So dot email, like so. And now if I'm going to reload the page, you can see that we're getting the email. So this right here is the email. If I'm going to reload again, I'm getting the email and so on. And now, of course, I could say that I want to store this user in a user state, for example. So I could say const user set user is equal to use state. In the beginning, this is just going to be empty. And now, for example, we can say that instead of console.logging this, we're just going to set the user to whatever we have instead of user.results of 0, like so. And now let's just console.log this one again. So we are just storing this object at the moment within our state right here. So this state will now contain this object. And now we could, for example, say that we just want to output user.gender, for example. Let's save that one. And as you can see, we're getting female right here. We can also say that we want to have this one instead of a div, like so. And we can also say that we want to have user.email, for example. Now we're having the email and we're having the gender. So we first called this API within the useEffect hook, stored the data by using the useState hook inside of the user variable, and now we can access all of the values within the user variable inside of React. But if you think about it, as I already mentioned, this code is asynchronous because it takes a little bit of time to first send a request to the server, then you have to await the request, so you have to wait the response. And once you got the response, only then you can use the data. So we are waiting a little bit of time for the data. So it might make sense to display a loading while the user is waiting for the data. If he has a super slow internet connection, for example, this request might take pretty long because he's sending the request goes off, but it's super slow, bad internet connection, and he's not seeing anything during this time. So just showing loading during this period might make sense. But as you can see, now I'm getting this error in the console. So let me show you. Uncaught type error cannot read property of null. And the reason for this is that user.gender, when loading the component for the first time, does essentially not exist because, as I said, this request here takes a little bit of time because we're sending a request to the server, waiting for the response. So this just takes time. And when loading the component for the first time, we do not have user.gender. So in order to fix that, we can just use this question mark right here, which means only access user.gender if it is really available, and the same for our email. And if it is not available, just render nothing essentially. And since we're waiting for our data right here, and once we have the data, we are re-rendering the entire component anyways because we're setting our user right here. It will then be available and we will then see our user.gender. But for a couple of milliseconds, we will not have our user and therefore not see our user. Once the user is loaded, we will set the user, re-render the component, and then we see user.gender and user.email. So you can see that we now have female as well as the email. Again, it might make sense though, during the loading time, so during the time we are awaiting the response, to show a loading state to the user. And we can do that by just using the use state hook again. So const loading set loading, which is equal to use state. And I'm going to say that this one is by default equal to false. So we're not loading by default. So now once we start to get the user data though, we are obviously starting to load. So in this case, we should say that set loading is going to be equal to true. And at the end, after we've set the user data right here, we know that everything worked. So set loading at this point should probably be false. So set loading is going to be equal to false because now we're done loading. And now we can use this loading variable right here to conditionally render a loading spinner. If we are loading, then we are of course loading and should display loading to the user. If we are not loading, then we should not display loading. So in our case, we can just go ahead, use JavaScript syntax right again. And now we can say if we are loading, so if loading is equal to true, and we can of course also write it like this, because this means the exact same thing. So if loading is equal to true, then we're going to render whatever we have after this and symbol. So div, for example, closing tag, and inside of this div, we can just return loading. Let me reload the page. And you can see we saw for a couple of milliseconds loading. So now I'm going to tell you already though that this is not the perfect way to do it. Obviously this code here awaits a fetch request. And every time we request something from a server, of course there can also occur an error. And if we get an error, then we should of course catch this error. And we can fix that by using a try catch block. And we're going to try whatever we have right here within the try block, like so. If we're getting an error, then in our case, let's just console.log the error, like so. And now we want to set loading to true right here, so right in the beginning. And after we've done everything, so once we've either tried or caught the error, only afterwards we want to set loading to false. And in that case, we can use the finally block of the try catch block. So finally will always run. It will run after our try block and it will run after our catch block. Whatever block will run essentially. So finally will run afterwards, and that is perfect because right after our try or our catch block, we want to set loading to false. So now this right here should work as well. Let me show you. We're getting loading again, as you can see, and then we're getting the result. So now in case we have an error though, it might make sense to display an error to the user. So we can again use state in order to fix it. So we can have an error state, so an error variable. We can set this variable by using set error, for example, and this one is going to be equal to use state. By default, we are not having an error, so I'm going to set that one to false. And now, in addition to console.logging the error, we can also set our error, and now our error, since we have an error, is equal to true. And now again, we can use conditional rendering with this error variable to display an error message in case the user gets an error. So let's just again go into JavaScript. If we have an error, then we want to return a div, for example. And instead of this div, we can just display whoops, for example, like so. Let's reload. We're having loading right now. And this time it took pretty long. So you really saw how loading works. Maybe I had a pretty bad internet connection right now. But now let's also simulate an error. So let's, for example, try to call an endpoint that does not exist by adding an A, for example. So if I'm going to call this endpoint, this is not going to work because this endpoint probably does not exist. And this error variable therefore should be equal to true, and we should display whoops. Let me save that one. Let me reload. And we're getting whoops after we loaded our data. So now during the loading process, we are seeing loading. If everything works, we are seeing whatever we have right here. If we get an error, then we're just going to display that right here. Let's understand useRef within React. Imagine we are having a button that says click me to focus and an input field of type text. And on button click, we want to focus this input field right here. So once we click this button, we want this input field to be focused. So first of all, we need to create a method that we call onClick. And that one can be handle focus input, for example. We don't have this method yet, so we need to create that one. So const handle focus input is going to be equal to an arrow function for now, to an empty arrow function for now, to be precise. And now we also need to have a reference to our input field, because of course we need to say which input field do we want to focus. We could also have 3 input fields, for example, and now we only want to focus the second input field right here, so this one. So we need to get the reference, and in order to get a reference to an element within React, we can use the useRef hook. So we can say const second input ref is going to be equal to useRef. We need to import this useRef hook from React. So let's click that one. And now we can use opening and closing brackets and define an initial value. The initial value by default is going to be null. So let's pass null right here. Why is it going to be null? Because when first rendering or defining this variable, to be precise, useRef is null because this component tree has not yet been rendered. But once we render this component tree, and therefore once we render the second input field in our case, we want to link this second input ref variable to this input field right here. And we can do so by using the ref attribute and passing the variable name that we want to link this input field to. So ref is equal to second input ref, like so. So now this variable holds this input field as a reference, and we can do something with this reference for now. So we could, for example, say second input ref. And for now, let me just console.log our second input ref so you really understand what is going on. Let's open this inside of the console. And as you can see, within our console, once I'm going to reload and once I'm going to click to focus, you can see that we're getting this object right here. And this object holds the current property. It always holds the current property. And current always displays the linked field. So you can see that current includes our input right here. So we could, for example, say that we want to get second input ref.current. So let's take a look at that one. Once I'm going to click, you can see that we're now getting this input field right here. So our second input field. And now let's go back. So this seems to work. So we can access our input field by saying second input ref.current. And now let's say on click, we just want to focus that input field. And for that, we can just use a normal JavaScript method .focus. And that will just focus that input field. So let me click this button. And as you can see, now we're focusing the second input field. And for those who know a little bit of JavaScript, a ref is pretty similar to document.getElementById. So you just get a reference to a certain element, and later on you can do pretty much anything with this element. So you could also say that you want to define the style. So you can just use normal JavaScript again and say style.background is going to be equal to yellow, for example. Let me save that one. And once we click now, you can see that the background color is now yellow. So by using the variable name followed by current, you get the reference to the element. And afterwards, you can just use normal JavaScript to, for example, manipulate the element. Once you click a button, once you do this or that, so that's up to you. How can we use images within React? And let me first of all show you the problem. So we're going to get an image. So let's, for example, just go to unsplash.com. And right here, let's just download any image. So let's get this image, for example. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to drag this image into our source folder, for example, and I'm going to rename this one to test.jpg. So now we're having this test image, and now I maybe want to render this test image within this page. I could, of course, go ahead and say image source is going to be /, and now I could just target test.jpg, and I'm going to save that one, and as you can see, we're not seeing anything. So this does not seem to work. If you want to use an image within React, you always have to import it, and then you can use it. So then you can pass it as a source. And you can do so by saying import, followed by the name that you want to use for this image. So that can be anything. It could be test, it could be sun, it could be royal. So let me use royal so you see that this works. And now we need to define the path. So we want to get this image from /. It's in the same folder. So we want to get this from test.jpg like so. So now we imported this image, but now we also need to pass this image to the source attribute right here. And we're going to do this within those brackets. So we're going to switch to JavaScript. And now we're going to pass royal right here. We're going to save this one. And as you can see, we get a super big image. It's obviously way too big. But let's also use a width of 100 pixels, for example, like so. And you can see that we're getting this image right here. Let's understand how to use icons within React. So imagine we wanted to use a home icon and a Twitter icon, for example, on this page. You can use a pretty nice library for that. To get icons, we can, for example, use React Icons, which is a React Icons library that provides a lot of different icons for React. Once loaded, you will probably see this GitHub link right here. So this React Icons preview for IO. So we are going to open this page. And now we will see a lot of different icons that we can use. And React Icons essentially just combines a lot of different libraries, a lot of different packages into one single big package and provides all of the icons. So all of the icons from all of the sub packages. So for example, some of you might know Font Awesome. Font Awesome provides a couple of different icons. And as you can see, we can take a look at all of the icons from Font Awesome 5, for example. So we have all of those packages, and React Icons essentially just includes all of the icons from all of the packages. So if we need a home icon, for example, we can just search for home within the search bar. We will now see all of the home icons from all of the different packages, and we can choose the one that we prefer. So we can, for example, get a home icon from FA, we can get a home icon from IO, we can get a home icon from MD, and so on. And in our case, let's say we want to grab this FA home icon. So we can click on this icon right here. And right here, you see the code that we need to incorporate this icon. So first of all, we need to import this icon. So let's copy this line. Let's go back to our code. And right on top of our code, we are going to paste in, this entire line, like so. So now we imported this icon. And now we can use this icon by using this icon as a component. So let's copy this component. Let's render this component within our div. And let's save this one. And now we also need to make sure that we installed this package right here. So in order to use this package, we need to install this package, and we can do so by saying npm I react -icons. This will install the React Icons library. So we get access to this import and to this component right here. And now once we go to our page, you can see that we are seeing this home icon. If we wanted to include Twitter right now, we could of course go back to our page to React Icons and search for Twitter. Now we want to get Twitter from FA Twitter, for example. So I'm going to import that one as well. And as you can see, FA Twitter comes from the exact same sub library. So React Icons /FA. So we can combine FA Home and FA Twitter right here. And we do not need two separate imports. Now let's also copy FA Twitter right here. Let's save that one. And now we should see Twitter and our home icon on the original page. If this icon would come from a different sub-library, like TFI for example, then we would need to create a new import. So then we would have to do this right here and add this icon right here, right below. And now this would still work, but we would need another additional import like so. And it's as simple as that to use icons within React. Let's understand modern routing in React. Right now, we are just rendering this app component within our main.jsx. So we are therefore displaying this app component right here within the browser. But if you think about the real page, usually you do not only have a single component, but you rather have multiple pages, maybe a home page, a login page, a register page, and so on. So in our case, let's try to create a minimalistic app that includes routing. So we're going to delete this app, and we're going to delete this app.jsx as well, because we do not need that one anymore. And now we will create a router. And in order to implement routing in React, we need to use a third-party package. The name of that package is React Router DOM. So just type React -router -DOM. Then we can go to the npm package manager, so React Router DOM npm. And right here you see the command to install the package. So we're just going to copy that command, like so. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's create a new terminal, a new command prompt to be precise. And now let's just paste that command in there. We're going to execute that one. And this one, after a couple of seconds, will install React Router DOM, which we can see if we go to the package.json file. And as you can see right now, we're using React Router DOM 7.9.6. So if you want to use the same version, just feel free to use that version. So now let me show you how this one works. In order to make this work, you usually first of all have to create a router, and that router defines all of the routes you want to implement within your page. So const router is going to be equal, and now we need to use a predefined method that we get from React Router DOM, and that method has the name create browser router. And as you can see, we can import that one from our React Router DOM, like so. So right here's the import, and now we need opening and closing brackets, because we're just calling the method that we're getting from the React Router DOM team. This method expects an array, a route array to be precise. So we are going to pass an array to this method, and inside of this array, we have to define our routes. We have to define each single route as an object. So we have a lot of objects, and every single object represents one page essentially. So the first object represents one page, the second object represents another page, and so on. Now we have to define a path right here. So that one is going to be the path to the individual page. And for the first route, let's just say that the path is a slash. And slash always just means just take the normal URL, and that's essentially it. So if a user is going to load the normal URL, then you will always land on a page that is defined by using the slash. So that is essentially the home page. If you think about Instagram.com, if you type in that URL, you're essentially landing on a page that you've defined by using a normal slash. And in our case, this could be the home page, for example. So let's create that page, because we do not have that page right now. So let's say home.jsx. We're going to create a const home being equal to an arrow function, like so. So we're going to create a component essentially. And this component is just going to return a div that has home as a text right here. Now we're going to export default home. And inside of our main.jsx, we now need to define an element, and we want to load this element in case the user loads this route essentially. And the element that we want to load is our home page. So we are going to import home from home.jsx, like so. So we have the import right here, and that is how it works. And as you can see, we are getting this error because I deleted the app.jsx, and obviously we need to remove the import right here as well. So now this works again. So you always use path to define a path, and the element to display a JSX element. And the element is basically just a normal React component. Now, right here within the strict mode, we also need to define something else to make this work. And what you need to define right here is the router provider. So this one is going to make sure that all of the routes are available within your entire app. And let's end that one, like so. Now this router provider also expects a router as a property. And this router is obviously just going to be, so this router property is just going to be equal to this router that we defined right here. And obviously I could also say that this here is going to be R, and then this here would have to be R as well. So I hope you get the idea. But let's stick with router. And as you can see now, I'm landing on the home page, as I already mentioned, if I'm just loading the normal page right here. So this seems to work. Now let's also define a users route, for example. So our path is going to be equal to /users, and the element is going to be a users component or a user component. We don't have that component yet, so let's create that one. So user.jsx const user is equal to this function right here. We're going to return a div that just says user for now. And now let's export default user like so. And now let's just render as an element the user component that we've just created. We're going to import that one from ./user.jsx like so. And now, as you can see, currently I just have the URL, so I'm landing on the home page. But if I'm now going to use /users, I will land on the users page. Let me show you. And as you can see, now we are seeing user right here. And now I can add as many routes as I want. I could also add another route, path, / whatever. Element is going to be, let's say we want to have a whatever.jsx element, const whatever, going to be equal to this function right here, return div whatever, export default whatever, like that. And now we can just use this whatever element right here to access a whatever page, like so. And as you can see, we're getting whatever right here. But what if we would access a route that does not exist at this point? So maybe something like this. And as you can see, now we're getting unexpected application error 404 not found, because this route does essentially at the moment not exist. Now, if you want to catch an error, you can just use the error element like so. So the error element for your home route, so for the slash. Usually it's enough if you have one single error element defined for the home route, because it's always going to check, does the route the user entered equal slash? If that is the case, then it's going to load the element. Otherwise, it's going to keep searching. Does the route equal slash users? If that is not the case, then it's going to keep searching. Does the route equal slash whatever? If that's not the case, then we know the input does not equal any route. But every single route that you can potentially enter is going to start with a slash, as you can see. So in that case, this error element will target everything that starts with a slash, but does not match the exact name afterwards. So we will always load this error element if we have anything after that does not match any of the given routes. So we can create this error element or an error page by saying error.jsx const error is going to be equal again to a normal arrow function like so. We're going to return a div that says error, for example. And now we're just going to export default error. So we're going to export our error component. And now we're just going to incorporate this error component right here, like so. We are reloading the page, and as you can see, we're now getting error because this is obviously not a valid URL. And I can also do something like this. We're still getting error. And if I'm going to do something like this, we're also getting this error page right here. So this is how you catch errors. Let me also show you how navigation between different pages can work. So we are going to go to our home page, and obviously you could just use a normal anchor tag that you get from HTML, like so. This one is going to have an href, and let's say this one will navigate to /whatever, for example. And the text is going to be whatever right here. So now let's go back to our home page and let's test whether this works. So now I'm going to click this button, or let me say go to whatever. Let's save that. So now we can press this button, we can go to whatever. It's going to reload the page, and now we are on the whatever page. So let me show you again. And I'll take a close look at this bar right here once I'm going to click. So I'm going to click, and as you can see, we had the short reload right here. So it took a short time to load the new page before displaying the new page. And the reason for this is that when clicking an anchor tag, you usually always send a request to the server. The server will therefore reply with the requested page. And once you got the requested page, then it will display the requested page. And that is just the default behavior of an anchor tag within HTML. And if you have a bad internet connection, for example, obviously this request will take a lot of time. But as I already said, a React application is a single page application that just appears to be a multi-page application, because a React team handles all of the stuff under the hood and uses JavaScript to dynamically change the pages. And that is why this reload is completely unnecessary and decreases the user experience, because a React app will allow you to change the page instantly. Let me show you. We can also use the link tag provided by React Router DOM. So we have to import that one, as you can see, from React Router DOM. Now this link component allows us to use the to property to define the route right here. Now we need quotation marks, and instead of those quotation marks, we can now define the route. So /whatever, for example. Let's close this anchor tag, and in between the link tag, we can define our text. So go to whatever, for example. Let me go back to the home page right here. So we again have this link. This looks the exact same, but you will see a difference if you take a look at this page right now. So I'm going to click that one, And as you can see, the change was immediately. So there was no reload. And now I can also go to the whatever page, for example, and I'm going to use a link right here as well from React Router DOM. That one is going to go to slash, so to our home page. And right here I have go to home. Let me save that one. And this here's go, so go to home. Now I can click go to home, go to whatever. And as you can see, I can change between those pages instantaneously without any reload and so on. Now let me also show you how to create a nav bar, for example. So we're going to our main.jsx, and let's also just remove this index.css file right here, because this just creates some standard CSS styles that we do not really need. So I'm going to delete that one, and as you can see now we're getting this look right here. So we're going to create a new component. That one can have the name navbar.jsx. We're going to create const navbar being equal to this arrow function once again. And for now, we're just going to return a div, and we're going to export default navbar like so. Now, instead of this navbar, we want to allow the user to switch between all of those pages. So we might need a couple of links in here that just redirect the user to the slash route. So to this path, and to this path. So pretty similar to the link. But in our case, we're not going to use the link, but we're going to use the nav link, as you can see, also provided by React Router DOM, opening and closing tag, because we need some text in here. And let's say we have one for the home page, one for the users page, and one for the whatever page, like so. And now we can also define the to attribute right here that is going to be equal to a slash for our home page, to that is going to be equal to slash users for our users page, and to that is equal to slash whatever for our whatever page, like so. So now let me just display this nav bar within all of our pages. So right here, we are just going to import nav bar like so from ./navbar. Same goes for the user page. So right here on top, let's just say nav bar like so. And obviously the same goes for our whatever page, where we say nav bar from ./navbar. So now you can see that we have those links right here. So home gets me to the home page, users gets me to the users page, whatever gets me to the whatever page. And again, the reload is instantaneously. So now what is the benefit of using a nav link over a normal link? And the difference is especially that you can add proper styling to each of these nav links, because React Router DOM handled that for us. So now we're going to say class name is going to be equal. And now we can pass a callback function right here to the nav link, or to the class name to be precise. We're getting a parameter right here. This parameter is usually an object, but we can destructure this object, and we're getting isActive from this object that will just return whether this nav link is active at the moment. So whether we are on this page right here. If that is the case, then isActive is going to be true. Otherwise, isActive is going to be false. So now let's use this arrow function. And if isActive is true, then we can, for example, by using the ternary operator, say that if isActive is true, we want to set the class name of active, for example. And otherwise, we want to set the class name of inactive. And obviously, those class names are up to you, but I just choose active and inactive. And now I need to define those class names in a style sheet, of course. So I'm going to create a new style.css file. And right here, I'm going to create .active as a class. And now for demonstration, let's just say text decoration is going to be none, and color is going to be black. Font weight is going to be bold, like so. And for .inactive, let's say text decoration is going to be none, and color is going to be black. So the active page is just going to have a font weight of bold, and that's going to be the only difference. So let's go to our navbar. Let's import the style sheet on the top. So we're going right here, import. And now we need to define a path. So we're going to say /, and now we need to get style.css, like so. I'm going to save. And as you can see, we're now getting this effect right here. But now obviously I need to use this class name that considers isActive for all of the other nav links as well to make this really work. So I'm going to add that one here and that one here. And as you can see now, home and user is written with a regular font weight, whereas whatever is bold. And the reason for this is that we are currently on the whatever page. If I go and change to the users page, so /users, users is now bold. And if I go to the home page, home is now bold. So by doing so, you can set the style dynamically. And you could, of course, also say that the active link should be red. And now you have a red nav link, as you can see, and the active route is always going to have this red color. And I know this looks terrible, but this was just for demonstration. So now let's imagine you have the users page, and on this users page, you also want to display all of the available users within your app. So maybe you get all of the users from your database, and then you want to display them here. So let's just simulate that one within our users component or within our user component. And actually the name users might make a little more sense. So I'm just going to replace that with users and users from users.jsx. And of course, I also have to rename this here to users.jsx, like so. So now right here, let's imagine we are having a couple of users. So const users set users is going to be equal to use state. Let's initialize our state with an array. And inside of this array, we will have a couple of users. Each user will have an ID, for example, and a username. Now I'm just going to copy this object, maybe 2 more times. So this one has an ID of 2, this one has an ID of 3, Vinny, and Gabak. And now again, we're just going to use the map method to display all of those users. So I'm going to switch to JavaScript syntax. I'm going to say users.map. For every single iteration, I'm going to get one single user. And I'm just going to return a link in our case. So I want to get a link from React Router DOM. Let me close that one. And inside of this link right here, I, for example, want to display the username. So I can access the username in this case by saying user.username. So I'm just accessing those usernames. And as you can see, now we're getting Jonas, Winnie, and Gabak. And for the link, I want to say that I want to go to /users. But now if I'm just going to go to /users, this doesn't really make too much sense because each individual user might have his own profile page. So if you think about Instagram, for example, you can go to Winnie, you can go to Gabak, and each individual person has his own user, has his own page where you can see his follower account, where you can see his pictures, and so on. And now we need to dynamically insert the ID to the end of the string to make this work. So I'll show it to you and then I'll explain it, because this might be a little bit easier. So we're going to equal. Now we need to use JavaScript code because we need to use backtick characters right here. We want to go to the /users route followed by a slash. And right here, we now want to insert the ID, for example. So user.id. So now the first link, if we click the first link, we are going to go to users /1 because that one is Jonas. Winnie is going to get to users /2 and Gabak is going to go to users /3. Like so. So now as you can see, we are displaying all of the users, and depending on the user we are clicking on, we are navigating to a different page. But of course, if we would go to our main.jsx, we would now have to define millions of routes for millions of users. So if we wanted to display Vinny, for example, then we would have to say path : /users /2, for example. And for Gabak, this would have to be 3, for Jonas, this would have to be 1, and so on. But that is, of course, nothing that we have to do because there is a good solution to that. And we can just fix that by using :id. So this now is a dynamic parameter that can essentially be every single value out there. So this one is going to be valid if this is going to be /users /1 /users /2 /users /whatever /users /Vinny. All of this is going to be valid. All of this is going to match this route right here. And now we can, of course, again, define an element. What kind of element do we want to display once we get redirected to this page? And we have a users page, but now we are getting an individual user, so user.jsx might make sense. Again, we're just going to create a component. So const user is going to be equal to an arrow function. We're going to return div user right here, for example. Now let's export default user like so. And now right here, we are just going to output the user that we're getting from ./user.jsx if we are landing on this route. Let me save that one. Now we're going to Jonas. And as you can see, we're landing on the user right here. So on the user route. For Jonas, it was users /1. If I'm going to enter /2, we will also be on that route. And if I'm going to enter something like this, we're also landing right here. So all of this is valid. So what is the purpose of this right now? because at the moment we're not really seeing data that does really fit to the user. So all of those pages look the same. And that is of course nothing that we want. So we somehow have to get the information, or we at least have to get the ID information. So the information that we're passing right here within our URL. And in order to do so, we can use the params. So let me show you. We can use the use params hook. So use params that we can get from React Router DOM. And that one will return all of the params that we're essentially passing right here. So this is a param. Let me show you. This here is going to be a method. So we have to execute that one. And this one is going to return the params. So I can say const params is going to be equal to use params. And now I'm just going to console.log the params so we really see what is going on right here. So I'm going to inspect console, and you can see that we are getting an object. This is the object, and this object holds our ID right here. If I'm going to rename this one right here though to ./whoopie, like so, we're now getting an object that holds whoopie. So the name that we're passing right here to this parameter is going to be the name that we are having inside of this object. But ID obviously makes a little more sense. Since this is an object, we can also immediately destructure it and say, okay, we only need to get the ID out of this object because in fact we only want to have the ID. And now if I'm going to qvedsad whatever, I'm getting that instead of the console. If I'm going to /1, I'm getting that in the console. And if I'm going to /2, I'm getting that in the console. So this parameter is equal to whatever we enter right here. So how is this useful in a real world application? I'm just going to show you a quick example. So imagine you have this useEffect hook right here that is going to do something once you load this component. So in the beginning, we're also going to have this dependencies array. And now if you think about a real page, then you have this ID right here. And you could, for example, say that you want to fetch the data from the database for the corresponding user. So get data for a user with the ID that is going to be equal to this ID right here. So to this ID essentially. So since we have this ID now, we know that the user should have the ID, the corresponding ID. So we can fetch this user or get this user from the database. If the user does not exist, we can obviously return an error. But if the user exists, we now have the data for the user, and we could again dynamically insert the data right here, for example. And that is just the theory behind this. We of course will get to that later on. Let's understand the useNavigate hook in React. The useNavigate hook in React comes from React Router DOM. So we first need to install React Router DOM by saying npm I React Router DOM, written like this. Let's press enter. Let's wait for this package to install. And now we have access to React Router DOM, so we can implement routing. Imagine we are having another file, so our about.jsx file, for example, which is just going to be this about component that might return a div, and inside of this div we might just have about, for example. We're going to export default about, like so. So imagine this is our about page and this is our app.jsx, so probably our home page. And now we want to have a button of type button, for example, and this button says go to about, like so. And now once we click this button right here, we want to change to the about page. So on click, we want to execute the function handle go to about, for example, like that. So now we need to implement this function because we do not have that one yet. So const handle go to about is going to be equal to this function right here. And now we somehow want to navigate to this page once we click this button. So how could we do this? And that is where we can use the useNavigate hook. So we're going to say const navigate, and this one is going to be equal to useNavigate, so to the useNavigate hook. And this useNavigate hook returns a function that we can now call to navigate. So this variable stores a function. Now we can say navigate, like so. We can call this function instead of this handle go to about function. And right here we can define the route where we want to go to. So let's say we want to go to /about, for example. And as you can see, we're getting this error right here. So useNavigate may be React Router DOM used only in the context of a router component. And we do not have this router component yet. So in order to make this here available, we first need to wrap everything inside of a router and define our routes. So we can say const router is going to be equal to create browser router. Again, This is a function also provided by React Router DOM. And inside of this router, we can now define our routes inside of an array. So right here, we have this array. Every single route will be inside of an object and is going to have at least a path. This path is going to be slash, for example, and an element. So what kind of element do we want to load when we access this path? And in our case, let's say this is going to be our app, so our home page. And now we need a second route that is going to have the path of slash about, for example, because that is going to be our about page. And right here, we are going to have the element or load the element about like so. So we're going to import that one from ./about or ./about.jsx as well, like so. So now we have our router, but now we also need to provide this router to everything we have. And that is pretty simple. We're just going to use the router provider from React Router DOM again, like so. So we imported that one right here. Now we can use the closing tag because this can be a self-closing component that only accepts the router. And this is now going to act as a router provider. So essentially this is just using the use context hook from React to provide a context. So therefore to provide the routing data to everything that we defined inside of this router. So to the element app and to the element about on our page. And now we can access app by just calling localhost. And if we want to go to the about page, we can say localhost/about. And as you can see, we land on the about page. So now we can access those routes. And now we can also use useNavigate right here, for example, to create this navigate function and therefore to handle routing as well. So let's click go to about. And as you can see, we are getting redirected to go about. And now we could also go to our about.jsx. We could also implement a button right here. Go to home, for example. We are again going to have const navigate, which is going to be equal to useNavigate, like so. And on click, so once we click this button, we can call this arrow function, and this arrow function is going to call navigate, so our navigate function, with the argument. And the argument is going to be the route where we want to navigate to, so our slash, our home page right here. So now we can go to home, go to about, go to home, go to about, as you can see. Now there's also another method. So let's say on our about page, we are going to use the navigate component from React Router DOM, as you can see. And this one here also accepts a to property. And let's say we want to go to slash, for example. This navigate component might have a text inside, doesn't really matter. Now let's save that one. We're going to go to about. And as you can see, we're never changing the page. Because once we get to the about page, we're immediately rendering this right here. So we're also immediately rendering this navigate component. And this navigate component is immediately redirecting us again to the home page, so to slash. So let's, for example, go to whatever, for example. Let me save that one. Let's go to about. And as you can see, we're getting this unexpected application error because we're going to the about page. We're rendering this component and immediately redirecting the user to slash whatever, as you can see. So if you want to do some routing immediately when rendering the component, you always want to use this navigate component. If you want to do something when a function is being called, for example, then you always want to use the useNavigate hook. And in most cases, you might want to use useNavigate, but in some cases, it also makes sense to use navigate. If you think about protected routes, for example, then you have a login state. And depending on the login state, you either want to render a component, for example, or you want to redirect the user immediately. So in that case, you would use a component that you will display, and you would also use this component essentially to immediately redirect the user if you do not render this component. So for example, the user is logged in, you want to render this component, the user is not logged in, you want to redirect the user immediately to the register screen, for example. Let's understand the context hook inside of React. First of all, let me show you what kind of problem the context hook solves. So imagine we are having our main file right here. Inside of this main file, we are rendering our app, so A, for example. Inside of this app, we might now, for example, render a couple of different pages. So maybe the home page, maybe the register page, maybe the profile page, and so on. And maybe every single component right here has a couple of subcomponents or is made up of subcomponents. So maybe the profile page has a component that displays the username, the profile picture, and so on. So I think you get the idea. Now, on every single one of those pages, it would be useful to have the user available. And of course, I could, for example, say that I'm going to load the user within the main function or within the main component to be precise. So I'm getting the user right here. And now I have to pass the user via props to our app. From our app, I have to redirect the props to our profile page, to our register page, to our home page, and so on. And from the profile page, I might have to redirect the user data to our profile picture, to the username, and maybe I have to keep passing it over and over again. So I think you get the idea. This is something that is not really efficient, and passing props over and over again can get really confusing. And to make it short, there is an easier way inside of React to do that. And that is the context. So you can, for example, create a context. Then you can wrap one of those elements with the context essentially. So I could, for example, say I'm going to wrap our main component instead of a context like so. So this is C for context. And now everything that gets rendered within the main function has access to the data inside of this context. So everything that is right below main has access to the context. If I only need the context right below our profile right here, I could also just wrap the profile with our context like so. But obviously a user is something that should probably be available within the entire app. So it might make sense to wrap the entire app. So everything within the main section. So how can we implement this provider inside of React? First of all, you have to create that context. So let's create a file that has the name userprovider.jsx. So userprovider.jsx. We first have to create a context. So we can say export const user context. The name is up to you, but since we are creating a user context might make sense. We're going to use create context. That is the hook that we can use to create a context given by React again. So now you can see we are importing create context and we're using create context right here. This is a method and we can use a default value. By default, it might make sense that we do not have a user, so user can be undefined, for example. So now we have the context, but that is actually not enough. We also need to provide this context. And in order to do so, within React, you usually use a component again. So we can say const user provider, because in the end, the user provider will provide the context. This here is going to create the context, and this here is going to provide the context. This is going to be equal to a normal component function like so. And then, of course, we are, as always, going to export this user provider component like so. And this user provider is in fact just going to return a component, and that component is going to be the user context dot provider. So we can access user context dot provider again, closing tag, and this is how it looks like. So now we have the provider. We also need to give a value to this provider. So what should be provided by this provider? So we are going to have the value property, and right here I can now, for example, just say username, whatever. So let's use a static value for now because this makes understanding a little bit easier. Now I'm exporting this provider, and now let me use this provider. Instead of our main.jsx, I'm just going to wrap the app component with our user provider like so. I'm going to remove that one here. And that's what this looks like. And let's maybe render some random text on the app page like so. But as you can see, we're not seeing anything. And what is the reason for this? Right now, the main component is our user provider. And we're having all of the children inside of this provider. But we're not really explicitly saying that we want to render, so display all of the children within this provider. And that is something that we have to explicitly do. So how can we do that? When we're getting props within React, by default, one of the props that React will offer us is going to be the children prop. So we can, for example, destructure children right here. Again, this will be offered to us by React. And now we can use children right here. So let's switch to JavaScript syntax, and we can now just display the children instead of the user context provider. And this just means once we wrap something in between this provider, like the app component right here, this app component is now a child to the user provider, and we're just going to output the children, in fact. To make it really short, children is a property that we get from the React team that allows you to just display everything that is wrapped inside of the component. So in our case, that is wrapped within the user provider. And we just have to do it to display app, as you can see. And now if I'm going to add a div, I'm also going to see that one. So I'm just going to display all of the children. If I'm going to remove that one, you can see that we're not getting the same result. So children is really important if you just want to output whatever you have inside. So now we're saying this user provider will provide whatever we pass as a value to all of the children, essentially. So to everything that we have inside of here. So everything that is within our app right now has access to the data within this value field right here. And this div, of course, also has access, but this one is actually pretty unnecessary. But we are not having access by default. So we have to say that we want to get access within a component if we want to get access. We can do so by saying, for example, use context. So now we are using the use context hook. And inside of the brackets, so this is a normal method, we have to define the context that we want to get access to. What was the context that we created? The context that we created right here is the user context. So we want to get access to this user context right here. So we have to say user context. We are importing that from our user provider file. So we are importing that from this file. And now we can store this context somewhere. So we can, for example, say const ctx is going to be equal to use context. And now let's just console.log the context. So we're really seeing what is going on right here. Let me inspect console. I'm going to reload. We're getting this object that includes the username, whatever. So now I could, for example, just go here and say ctx.username. So we're just accessing this object right here. And as you can see, now I'm getting whatever, because that has been the thing that I added to the value field. So now let's make this example a little bit more realistic. We can, for example, say that instead of this user provider, we are going to have a user and a setUser function that is going to be equal to useState. And instead of the state, we are just going to have a user. And our user by default is going to be undefined, for example. Let me save that one. And now we can pass our user right here. So user is going to be equal to user, and setUser is going to be equal to setUser, so to this function. So we're just passing our user and our setUser function. So now if I'm going to take a look at the console.log statement, we're seeing that we're having this user right here. The value is undefined right now, and setUser as a function. So let's, for example, say that we want to set our user within another subcomponent. So let's, for example, say we are going to create a home page. So home.jsx const home is going to be equal to just a random function, and I'm going to export default home like so. And I'm going to return a div that says home for now. Now I'm going within the main.jsx. I'm also going to render the home page like so. So now we're having home. And let me also just add app right here. So we are having home and app right here. So both of those components are within our provider right here. So both of those components have access to our context. So within our home component, I could also say const ctx is going to be equal to use context. I want to use the user context right here. And from the user context, I might want to get the setUser function. So setUser, I'm going to destructure this object. And now I'm having setUser. So now I could just add a button right here that says click, for example. So now we have this click button. And I'm going to add a function. So an on-click handler right here. And this one has the name handle click, for example. We have to define this function. So we are saying const handle click is going to be equal to an arrow function. And once we click on this button, we're going to set the user to an object, for example, that has a username, what, and an ID of 1, for example. Now let's inspect the page. I'm going to click. We're getting this user that now has a username of what and an ID of 1. So we were able to set the user outside of this user provider essentially. And now within our app.jsx, we can also access this user. So right here, we can now just say, let's take a look at the context again. So as you can see, if we have a user, I'm going to click. So now we have this user. And if we have a user, we just want to output the username, for example. So I can just say ctx.user.username like so. And as you can see, now we're having what? Let me reload. We're not seeing anything. And the reason that we're not seeing anything right here is that we're getting an error because we are accessing the username before it even exists. So we have to use this question mark, which means only access the username if it exists, otherwise don't. So now we're having click, and now I'm going to click and we're getting what right here once the username exists, as you can see. So now we're essentially able to access our user within the app component and within the home component. And this is probably a very minimalistic example, but in a real app, this could get a lot more complex, and maybe we would have hundreds of components within the home page or hundreds of components within the app.jsx, and then we would have to pass and pass and pass props. But with the context, that is something that we do not have to do anymore, and we can just use the user pretty much anywhere. So let me just summarize this really quick. To create a context or to use a context, you first have to create a context. This will initialize the context with a basic value. Afterwards, you also have to provide the context. In order to provide the context, you need to create a provider. You create the context provider by using the context name followed by a dot provider. And instead of this provider, you have to pass the value property right here that defines what kind of values you want to pass. So those double brackets here mean first, we are using JavaScript, and instead of this JavaScript syntax, we are now passing a JavaScript object. So usually you pass all of the values within a JavaScript object to all of the subcomponents. Now we're using children to say everything that is wrapped within this provider will get access to everything that we are providing within this value property. Then you have to decide where you want to use the provider. In our case, we wanted to use the provider for every single thing that is wrapped within this user provider right here. So you wrap the components that should have access to the values with the provider, and then every component and every subcomponent of these components again has access to the context and therefore to the values. You can access the context, so the values, by using useContext, so the useContext hook, followed by the context that you want to access. In our case, it's the user context. This again is just an object because we said that we want to have an object right here or pass the values as an object. So I can also destructure this object, but you can also just get the context. So this is valid, but I could also destructure user like this. And this is valid as well. So that again is up to you. And that is all you really need to understand the context. Let's understand the useReducer hook inside of React. Imagine we are having a couple of input fields. So maybe we are having an email right here of type email, name is going to be email, and the placeholder is probably going to be email. Now we're having another input field of type text, for example, that is going to be responsible for storing the username. So the placeholder is going to be username, and we have the last input field of type password, for example. So input, like so. Name is going to be password, and placeholder is going to be password. So now we have 3 input fields, and now it would be an option to create one state for every single input field. But there's also an alternative that essentially allows you to create a combined state, and that is the useReducer hook. So let me show you. To create the useReducer hook, we are again going to use const. Now we use array destructuring, and right here we are getting the state, and we're getting a setState function that you usually call dispatch. So that is just the convention right here. Now this one is going to be equal to useReducer. So this useReducer hook is again provided by the React team and will return an array that contains the state and the dispatch function, so the setState function essentially. But now this useReducer function also takes 2 arguments. The first one is going to be a reducer function, and the second one is going to be an initial state. For now, let's just pass reduce right here as the reducer function and initial state as the initial state. We don't have those values right here that we're passing as arguments, so we first have to create them. For our initial state, let's say const initial state is going to be equal, and since we want to use the useReducer for those 3 input fields, we need to use an object in this case. So we want to store all of those values inside of an object. So let's create this object, and right here we need to define the initial values. Our email should, for example, be an empty string. Our username should also be an empty string in the beginning, and the password should also be an empty string in the beginning. So this here is going to be our initial state. Now we also need to create a reduce function. So for now, let's just say const reduce is going to be equal to an empty arrow function like so. And now let's just save that, and we're getting this result. So right now I can just enter username, password, and so on, but we're not storing those values inside of the state. So we're not having access to those values. So let's first of all say that this value right here, so the value inside of our email field, for example, is going to be equal to state. What is our state? Our state will get initialized with our initial state right here. So our state right now is just this object right here. So we can access our email by saying state.email, for example. So our value is going to be equal to state.email. Now the value for our username is going to be value being equal to state.username, like so. And for the password, we have to say value is going to be equal to state.password. Now, if we're going to type something in here, we're not getting any result because we're initializing our state with an empty string right here, but we're never changing this string. So we are essentially not having any option to update this field. In order to update this field, we need to use the onChange property of the input field. So onChange is going to be equal. We're getting an event right here. So everything up to this point is pretty much the same as the set state. But in this case, we're not using the set function. Our set function this time has the name dispatch. So we're just going to say dispatch right here. Now, when using useReducer, we're not just passing a value right here. So we're not just saying e.target.value, because we need to know two things. We need to know which input field has been updated, and we need to know what is the value of the updated field. So again, since we need two things, it might make sense to pass an object and pass all of the information there. And again, the key value pairs that we enter right here are up to us. So I'm just going to define that the type of dispatch is going to be email, like so. But it could also be anything. I could also say that this is going to be this is going to be this. I just have to access this object later on. So I just have to remember the property name I used. But what kind of names I use for the key value pairs is up to me. So choose whatever fits you or stick to the convention. And I would obviously recommend you to stick to the convention. Now, for the type, we're going to say email. For the value, it might make sense to get e.target.value. So the value of this input field. This here would usually be the value that we would pass when using setState. And when using this dispatch function, we are calling this reduce method that we defined right here. So the one that we defined right here. And this reduce method by default gets our state and gets the action essentially. What is the action? So the action is just the object in our case that we're passing right here. So the action is just what we're passing right here within this dispatch function, whereas the state is just the current state. So in our case, the current state is obviously our initial state because we never updated it. But if we would have an updated state and we would call this reduce function again, then it would obviously be the updated state. And action, I'm just going to show it to you. I'm just going to visualize it to you. So state is going to be equal to this at this point. And action in this case is going to be equal. Let me show you. Action is just equal to this object essentially. So this is our action object. Let me keep this one for you so you really understand what is going on. Now we can say if action dot, now we want to access the type property. So if action dot type is going to be equal to email. So if we're updating our email at this point, then we want to set the value or change the value of our initial state. So we have to return. What can we return? Our initial state is an object. So it might make sense to return an object again, where we store all of our values. Now we can just destructure our state that we're getting right here, which is our initial state at the moment. And we only want to update one single field. So we want to update our email field. So we can just say email colon, and our email is equal to action.value. So to the value that we're getting by using e.target.value. So action.value right here. Now we're going to save this one. I'm going to delete this action type because that one would be wrong. And now let's test whether the email works right now. And now you can see that I can just type anything in here and we're getting this value, whereas we're not getting an update for username and password yet. Let me also console.log the state, so you really see what is going on right here. Log state, like so. Let's open the console, inspect, and now you can see in the beginning we're having this object right here that has an empty email, password, and username. If I'm now going to enter something, you can see that our email field gets updated, whereas password and username remain empty. Now let's also update username and password right here. In order to do so, we can just say onChange. We again get our event, and now we want to again dispatch something. So set the state. Essentially, if you want to compare this to set state, we need to call this one, pass an object again. Type in this case is going to be username, for example, and the value is going to be equal to e.target.value. Now for our password field, again, we're calling onChange, or to be precise, we're dispatching something onChange. So dispatch, we are again passing this object. Type here is going to be password, like so. And value is e.target.value, like so. We're going to save that one. And now we just need to adjust this reduce function. So if action.type is going to be equal to username. Then we're going to return our state, and we are only going to override our username with our action.value in this case. Let's save that one. And if action.type is going to be equal to password, in that case, we're going to return this object again. We're going to pass our old state. So we're just going to keep our old state, but we're going to override our username with action.value. And obviously right here, we need a colon like so. So we're going to save that one. And now it should be able to update every single field. And somehow our password field does not seem to work. And right here, we need to say password instead of username. So that was my bad. So let's save that one. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we are now getting this object. This object updates on every single field. And as you can see, we are updating email, password, and username. I know useReducer can really be confusing, but just keep in mind that the useReducer hook just uses an object essentially to pass values. So you encapsulate everything inside of an object and pass objects around to store multiple things. And in fact, this right here would not really be an example where you would have to use useReducer. But if you would get an error state, for example, a success state, and so on, so a lot of different states that you all want to update together, then useReducer might make sense. But to be honest, I barely ever use this as well. It's your favorite NPC, and over the next hours, I'll teach you everything you need to understand Firebase in React. We'll learn how to create data, read it, update it, and delete it. We'll also look at register, login, logout, and authentication in general, all with real examples so you can really understand it on a deeper level. So let's get started, guys. Firebase is Google's backend platform that lets you build the backend for your applications without managing your own servers. It gives you ready-to-use backend tools so you can focus on building your app instead of configuring infrastructure. What services does Firebase offer? It offers a lot of different services, but the most important ones are authentication, Firestore database, storage, and hosting. Authentication handles user accounts. It lets you register, log in, log out, reset passwords, or sign in with Google, Apple, GitHub, and more. No backend code needed. Firebase manages everything securely for you. Firestore database is a real-time NoSQL database where you store data like user-generated posts or messages. It syncs instantly across different devices. Storage, on the other hand, can be used for uploading files like profile images, videos, documents, or thumbnails. Firebase's hosting service allows you to deploy websites or static apps globally with a single command. A fast and secure way to share your website with others. So why should you use Firebase? Because it removes the hardest part of backend development: authentication, databases, security, scaling, and deployment. Firebase handles millions of user accounts automatically, so you can build prototypes fast. And in addition, it's really cheap for what it offers. In short, Firebase gives you authentication, databases, storage, hosting, and backend logic, all managed by Google and ready to use in minutes. In this short section, I will explain CRUD and authentication to you. So I will explain how you can create, read, update, and delete data inside of Firebase. And I will also show you how to authenticate a user, so how to register, log in, and log out, and track the authentication status within your entire app, all by using Google's backend Firebase. To take a look at Firebase, we can go to Google, for example, and just enter Google Firebase, for example. Then you can access the first link right here. We first have to sign in. So now we just have to sign in using our data right here. After signing in, you should land on this page right here. And now we can create a new Firebase project. Here we need a name for our project. This name can be anything, but I'm going to say showing this is easy, for example. We're going to continue. You can keep this activated, but it's not really necessary. Let's continue. We can disable Google Analytics because we do not need them for this project. Create project. This is going to take a short time. Now once your project is set up, you can press continue. And now this is the page that you will probably see. And you pretty much don't need anything of this. The only really important tabs are this build tab right here and this add app tab right here. Let's start by using the build tab. And right here you can see a lot of services that Firebase provides. One of the services that we need later on is authentication to authenticate the user. So register, login, log out, and so on. And another one that is pretty important for us is Firestore database. So this here is just a normal database essentially where you can store your data. So create data, read data, update data, and delete data. And this is responsible for authentication. So let's start by using Firestore database. So we want to store data in a database. We land on this page. Right here we can press create database to create a new database. Standard edition should be enough. So let's press next. Right here you can choose a database location, and this location should ideally be pretty close to your users, because the closer the database, the faster the connection. And in my case, I'm going to be the only user, so I'm going to choose Europe right here. Let's press next. Let's start in test mode so we can really test this. And let's create. If you want to switch to production later on, you can always do that. But for now, let's start in test mode and let's create our database. And as you can see right here, we now have our database. We can already start a collection. So we could, for example, say, let's start a collection. The collection ID is going to be users. And now we need a document ID, and maybe this is the user that has a random ID. Maybe we have one field. This field is going to be our email and hello@gmail.com. So let's save this one, and I just want to show you how this works. There's nothing that you really have to do yourself. But it's important that you have this database right here. So you have one database. Inside of this database, you can have a couple of collections. So you can have a users collection, you can have an orders collection, you can have a millionaires collection, you can have a brokies collection, and so on. So you can have a lot of different collections for a lot of different purposes. And as the names already imply, a users collection is, for example, responsible for storing all of the users, whereas a brokies collection might be responsible for storing all of the people who are completely broke. So that is the purpose of a collection. And inside of this collection, you have different documents, and every single document is responsible for one entity. So if you have a users collection, every document is responsible for storing one single user. This here could be user 1, then we might also have user 2, 3, and so on. And every single document then has a couple of key value pairs. So right here, the email is the key, and this right here is the value. And now we could, of course, also add a username, a password, and so on. So we could store a lot of data for every single user. And this is essentially how this works. We have a DB. The DB stores collections. Collection stores documents. Documents store key value pairs, for example. So let's just keep that in mind. Now we need to incorporate this Firestore database into our document. Let's go back to project overview, and as I already mentioned, this add app is pretty important, so let's press that one, and this allows us to add an app or to add Firebase to our app. And we can choose from a lot of different things. So if you're developing for Apple, Android, and so on, you can choose that one here as well, or Unity or Flutter, but we are developing for the web, so we need to choose web. Now we need to define an app name. So Firebase is easy, for example. I'm going to register the app. And right here, we are seeing what we have to do to add Firebase to our project. So first of all, we need to install Firebase. So let's copy this to the clipboard. Let's paste this in here. npm install Firebase. Let's enter, or let's execute this command. We're going to wait for this to finish. And once installed, we should also include this code within our app. So let's copy this code. Let's go to our source folder and create a new file. That one can have the name firebase.js, and inside of this file we can just copy and paste this code. A lot of people will tell you that you should always secure those keys right here, so store them in an environment variable, for example, but actually Google itself states that those keys do not need to be private and that they are meant to be public, so everyone can access them anyways, because this right here just allows you to connect to the database. And inside of Firebase, so let's go to the console. So let's go to our database right here, and right here you can see this rules tab. If you want to get your app to production, those rules are really important because they, for example, define who can write what, who has permissions, and so on. So those keys here are not meant to secure your database. The thing that really secures the database is going to be this rules file right here. So if you want to get this to production, you really need to make sure that those rules are valid and safe. This right here is not where your security starts, and it's totally fine if this right here is going to be public, because as I said, this is not what should secure your app. But for now, let's just go on with that. So now we created our database. So let's, for example, use Firebase to store something in the database. And to store something inside of the database, we first of all need to get access to our database. And we can do so by saying import get Firestore, which is the database, from Firebase/Firestore. Now we need to initialize a database object. So const db is going to be equal to get Firestore, like so. And get Firestore will take our app object that we created right here. And we also want to export this database because we will need this database inside of different files. So to explain what is going on right here, we are first of all defining the configurations right here. So we have this API key, auth domain, project ID, and so on, that allows us to connect our project to Firebase. And now we're initializing this app object with those configurations. And now whenever we want to get access to Firestore, for example, to authentication and so on, we want to pass this app object to the function when initializing Firestore, for example, or authentication and so on. So that is how this usually works. And this DB object now allows us to get access to Firestore, so to one of Firebase services. Let's go into our app.jsx, for example, and let's say we want to create a new post. So we can have an input field of type text, for example. This is going to have the name post, ID is going to be post, and let's say the placeholder is going to be post. And let's keep this super minimalistic. We're just going to have this post right here, and now we're also going to have a submit button, so button of type submit, that says add post. And whenever we click this button, so on click, we want to execute a function, and this function has the name handle add post, for example. So this function will add a post inside of the database. Let me delete that one, and let's say const handle add post is going to be equal to an arrow function, like so. And now to add a new post to the database, we first need to get a reference to this database, or to be precise, to this collection right here, to which we want to add the new document. Let's store the reference inside of a reference variable, so const post ref is going to be equal to collection, and this here is a method that Firebase Firestore provides. So as you can see, we are importing collection from Firebase/Firestore. And every time you want to define a reference to a certain collection, you use this collection keyword, followed by opening and closing brackets. And as you can see, this method expects to get the reference to Firestore, which is going to be the reference to our database, essentially. Since we exported that one, we can also import it right here from ./source/Firebase. So now we imported our database. The second argument that we need to enter right here is going to be the path. So to what collection do we want to add our document later on in our case? And in our case, it's going to be the posts document, like so. Why posts? That's just a name I can choose, pretty similar to users, for example. But in our case, I don't want to store into the users collection. I want to create a new collection. And if the collection does not exist, it's going to create this collection. If it exists, it's going to write into the collection. Since we do not have the post collection right here for the first document, it's going to create the post collection and then write into the post collection. So let's save that one. But at the moment, we're just getting the reference to this collection that we will create later on. But now we also need to write into that collection. So we need to say await. And now we can use add_doc, which is also a Firebase Firestore method. So a method that Firestore provides for us that we can now call. And as you can see, as the first argument, this expects a reference to the collection we want to write to. So this can be our post ref. And as the second argument, this expects data. And obviously this data can just be a post, for example, or a message that can be equal to, hey, first post, like so. So that is completely valid. But since we're using await right here, this function, of course, also needs to be async, so asynchronous. Now let's go to our React page. And now let's just press the add post button. So I press this button. Let's go to our collection right here. Let me reload the page. And you can see we created the posts collection. Instead of this posts collection, we created this document and we have the message, hey, first post. So what is this document name right here? By default, if you use the add document method right here, it's going to create a random ID for this document right here and just use this random ID as the document name. If you want to also set the ID, you have to use setDoc right here. But now our post ref also needs to include an ID. So now this post ref should have the database, posts, and it should also include the ID. which is again a string, and now it could be 1, 2, 3, for example. So right now we are hard coding this value. This is something that will not happen in reality, and we'll see later on how this is going to be used in real life. But for now, let me just show you how setDoc works. And since we're now not really accessing our collections to be precise, but rather accessing a document instead of a collection, because we're going into collections, but then we're also going to documents because we're specifically adding a specific document, we need to use doc right here from Firebase/Firestore instead of collection. Again, because up to this point, we were only accessing collections, but once we add this ID, we are now accessing collections, documents. So if you want to add a specific document, always use doc. If you want to access a specific collection and just auto-generate the ID, then you use collection. And now let me show you that this right here works as well. By going to React course, we're pressing add post once again. And we now added this post that now has the ID 123. So you can see that I can also choose the document name by using setDoc combined with this document syntax. But in our case, we obviously want to use addDoc because we want Firebase to automatically generate our ID, so our document name. And I'm saying that this here is going to be the ID because usually this here is going to be unique within Firebase. So every document will have a unique name, and you can use this as an individual ID later on. For example, uniquely identify every single user, every single post, and so on. But now instead of having this hard-coded message, let's also use a state to get our input message. So I'm going to say const message set message is going to be equal to use state, like so. This is going to be initialized with an empty string. Our input will have a value of message, and on change, I'm going to get this event object, and I'm going to set our message to e.target.value. So just a normal use state function to set our message, and now we can use this message right here to set the message inside of this object, like so. And since this and this here is the exact same, and we're using modern JavaScript syntax, we can just leave the second message away, and this is going to mean the exact same. Now let me go to this page once again. Let me enter, hey, this is the first post. We're going to add this post, and hey, this is the first post. It's going to be our second document right now. And whoopee, add post. You can see we added a new post, and this here is going to have the message whoopee. So it's as simple as that to add data. Now let's also start to read the data. So imagine right below, I'm going to have an h1, and that says all posts, for example. Let me save that one. So now we have all posts right here, and right below I want to display all of the posts. When do I want to get all of the posts? I want to get all of the posts when first loading this component. So I should use useEffect as a hook that we want to call when first loading this component, because then we want to fetch all of the posts. And I'm going to use an empty dependencies array for now. How can I now get all of the documents? That is again pretty simple. We have addDoc, so we also have getDoc to get one single document, or getDocs to get a lot of different documents. In our case, we want to get a lot of different documents, so I want to use getDocs, for example. And getDocs, as you can imagine, expects a collection, for example, where we want to get the documents from. So we should again define a reference. What is going to be the reference? In our case, we want to access every single post within our posts collection. So we need access to our posts collection. So we can again say const posts ref is going to be equal to this collection that we have. Where do we have it? Instead of our database, so db, comma, what is the path? Again, we are going to access posts. And now if you wanted to get a single document, you would again have to use doc because you're accessing a single document followed by the document name right here, for example. So this would be 123, for example, for this document right here. But in our case, we want to get all of the documents, so we have to access the collection. And we do not need to get the ID right here, or the document name to be precise. So let's save this one. And now to our getDocs method, we need to pass this posts ref right here, so the reference to our collection, where we stored all of our posts. And again, since this right here is a call to our database, this is obviously going to be asynchronous. So we need to wait this here. Why is this going to be asynchronous? Because we're calling the database. Calling the database always includes a request that takes some time. and a response that takes some time. And every time something takes some time, we need to use await. But if we want to use await, this needs to be inside of an asynchronous function. So we need to define this function. So this could have the name const get posts, which is going to be equal to an async function, like so. Let's save this one right here. We can also place this inside of a try catch block, because of course, when calling a database, there can also occur an error. So we need to catch this error. And we're going to try to do this. Now we need to call this get posts function right here to really execute that one. And again, since we're inside of the useEffect hook, something like this is not possible because useEffect or the callback function within useEffect can never be asynchronous. So if you want to use asynchronous code within useEffect, you always have to define a separate function and then call this function later on. So that is why I'm going to do this like this. And right here, to be precise, I should also use a try catch block because of course I'm calling the database and there can always happen something unexpected. So I should console.log the error like so and add that one into the try block like so. Again, now we are getting the documents right here. So we should also store the documents in a variable, for example. So this can be our posts doc, for example, which is going to be equal to await get docs. So we're getting the docs. And once we're getting the documents, let's also console.log posts doc like so. So we really can see what is going on right here. Let me open the console so you understand it. Let me reload. And as you can see, we're getting this query snapshot. So that is what we're getting from the database. And as you can see, this one includes docs, empty and size. And docs and empty might be kind of important for a lot of you. So you could, for example, check if post docs.empty, for example. And let's just console.log that. And we're getting false, so this does not seem to be empty. And now, of course, you could use this to check whether this is going to be empty. If this is going to be empty, you're going to do something. If this is not going to be empty, you're going to do something else. And in our case, let's just check whether this is not going to be empty. If this is not going to be empty, let's first of all console.log postdoc.docs. So you really understand what is going on right here. Again, let's go to the console. Let me reload. And you can see now we're getting this query document snapshot, which includes all of the individual documents. So we have an array that includes the first document that has the index ID 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So this will get us all of the documents. So we can now access the first document, for example, by saying index, we want to get the document that has index number 0. So we're getting this snapshot right here. And to get the data from this individual document, we now have to use data like so. So this will get us all of the data from this individual object. So from this individual document. And as you can see, we're getting this message right here. So now, of course, we want to store all of the documents instead of a posts variable, for example. So how can we do that? Let's just keep this right here as a memory of how a document looks. And let's say const post is going to be equal to postdoc.docs. If you remember, this is going to include all of the individual documents, but now we want to get every single document. So we need to map over those documents and extract the data for every single document and then store it inside of this posts array in the end. So you will see how this goes. So dot map, we're going to loop over every single document. For every single iteration, we're going to have one value. One value is going to be one single post document. So this you can also be doc, for example. So this doc variable will hold one document for every iteration. And now we just want to return the data from this document within an object. So we could just, for example, say, let's return doc.data like so. And now let's just console.log our posts instead. And you will see how this looks. So let me save. Let me reload. And you can see we're now getting this array. That includes the first, the second, the third, and the fourth message. But now this is something that usually is not perfect because now obviously we have the message, but we do not really have a unique identifier for every single object. In order to fix that, we can also say that we want to return an object. And now we can access doc dot. And as you can see, we're getting data, exists, get, and also the ID. What is the document ID? The document ID, let me first select this one, is going to be the name that we have right here. And as I said, Firebase is going to make sure that this name is going to be unique. So every single document name should be unique, can be used as a unique ID to uniquely identify every single object. And we can access that one by saying doc.id. So we can, on one hand, access doc.data to get all of the data stored within the document. And we can use doc.id to get the document name, so the ID of the document. And now we want to store doc.id instead of an ID key, for example, inside of this object. And now we can just spread doc.data like so. And since this is going to be an arrow function, we need to pass this object inside of normal brackets like so. So this really detects that this here is going to be an object and not just the function body. Now let's save this one. And now we are going to console log posts again. Let's take a look. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting this object that now includes the ID. And as you can see, this ID right here, for example, is in fact the ID that we stored inside of Firebase. And this ID is also the ID that we stored right here. So this posts array now includes all of our documents, and now we can just create a new state that should store all of our posts. So const posts set posts is going to be equal to use state, and we're going to initialize with an empty array right here. Because in the end, before loading or fetching all of the posts, this in fact is an empty array. And now we are going to say that we want to set posts to our posts variable that we defined right here. So right here. And now if we console.log the posts right here, so those posts that we now stored inside of the state, we can now access the posts as you can see right here. So this is just an array that includes a lot of objects. Now we can of course add or access this array right here, for example, inside of a div by just switching to JavaScript syntax. And now we can, for example, say posts.map. For every single iteration, we're getting one post object. And let's say we're just going to return a div right here, like so. And instead of this div, we now want to render post dot. What kind of keys does this post object have? It has the ID and it has the message. So we can, for example, access post.message like so. Let me save that one. And as you can see, we're getting, hey, first post, whoopee, hey, this is the first post, hey, first post. But we're getting this error. Each child in the list should have a unique key prop. So we need to create a key. What could be a unique key in our case? This could be our ID. So post.id. And of course, this needs to be key being equal to post.id, like so. And now you can see that this error is gone because every single post has this unique ID. So this ID right here, and every post has this message, which we display inside of the div. But now let's imagine this here is going to be a button. So button and button. And now we want to delete one of those posts. So if I'm going to click on this button, I want to delete this post. And I know that this post is going to be the corresponding post within the database, because we have this key that has the post ID right here. And of course, we can use this post ID right here also on a button click to identify the button. So if I'm going to click this button, for example, I know this is going to be the corresponding post ID. And now I can look in the database whether this ID right here, for example, corresponds to the ID of the click button. And if that is the case, then I can delete this post. So we're going to create a new function in order to delete that has the name const handle delete, for example, which is going to be equal to an arrow function. And now I need to identify the object or the document in this case that I want to delete inside of the database. And I can do so by expecting an ID right here inside of this handle delete function, which will uniquely identify the document that we want to delete. So let me show you. Within this button, I'm going to add the onClick property. This is going to be this arrow function that is going to call handle delete onClick, and is going to pass the ID right here. This ID is equal to post.id, which uniquely identifies every single post. So if we click the first post, for example, it's going to pass the ID of the first post right here to handle delete. Now that we have this ID right here within handle delete, we can say that const docRef is going to be equal to a document. Why do we need to add a document? Because we want to have access to a document. So we need to use doc as a function right here. We have to access our database. We have to access our posts collection. and we specifically have to access the document that has the given ID. So this ID right here. And now we can just say await delete doc by using the delete doc function that is provided by Firebase Firestore. Let's import that one right here. Opening brackets, we need to pass a reference, which is going to be our doc ref. And since we use await right here, this here should be asynchronous as well. And we can put all of this inside of a try catch block. And we're going to console.log our error in case we get an error. And obviously this right here looks absolutely terrible, but I think you get the idea. So we are going to delete whoopee for now. And as you can see, whoopee is essentially gone. So let's also delete hey first post, and you can see first post is gone. And now let's also make sure that we automatically update our UI, because up to this point we only update the user interface once we reloaded the page and once we have a new fetch of our posts. But fetching the post every time to just update the user is obviously not too good, because obviously we could just fetch the posts afterwards once again and then update within the UI. But that is something that is not really necessary, because in fact we have our posts right here. So we can just filter posts and essentially remove the post with the given ID. And that is pretty simple. Again, we're just going to say post.filter right here. For every single post, we're getting this post object. And now we can check whether post.id is not equal to the ID that we are getting right here. So if the post of the current iteration, so for iteration 1, for example, has not the ID, so the post ID of the clicked post, then we're just going to return it and store it within a new array that has the name new posts, because I define it as new posts. Otherwise, we're just not going to return this post at all. So the post that has the ID of the clicked post will not be returned. Every other post will be returned and be stored within this new posts array. And now we can just set our posts to our new posts array. And this should be new posts, like so. And now I'm going to click hey first post. You can see we removed this one from the user interface, and we also removed this one from our document right here, or from our collection right here. And now I can also delete this one. It's gone. And it's gone right here as well. Now let's also imagine we want to update a given post. And that is something that we can do as well. So we could also just put this inside of a div again. So we have this wrapper div right here. Instead of this wrapper div, we're going to have this button that displays the post text, for example. Obviously, this is a bad example. You could also display the text within a paragraph. So let's just do that, for example. Let's say we have this paragraph. We display post.message within this paragraph. We need to move the key to our div, because that is the parent element right now, and the key should always be added to the parent element. So now we have this wrapper div that includes the key. We have this paragraph that includes the message. And inside of this button, we say delete, for example. And now let's also add an update button. So button, this is going to have the text update. And right before, we are going to have an input of type text, for example. And the placeholder is going to be update value, like so. And now this is pretty similar to handle delete. We're just going to create a new function that we will call on click. So we'll say on click. We are passing this function right here that is going to call handle update. We're going to pass post.id to this handle update function. We don't have this handle update function yet, so we need to create that one. So again, we're going to say const handle update is going to be equal to this arrow function. We're expecting to get an ID right here. We are again trying and catching. So we're trying to do something. If this does not work, we're catching this error right here. What kind of document do we want to update? We of course need to get the post ref, which is going to be equal to an individual document that is inside of our database, inside of posts, and has the ID that we accept right here. And now we're going to await update document, which we can again import from Firebase/Firestore. So you see, all of this exactly works the same. You just have to remember a couple of different methods that Firebase provides, but the method names are actually pretty similar as well. So that is pretty simple as well, I would say, once you get used to this. And now this one just expects a reference again. We created this reference right here. So we have to pass this in here as an argument to our update doc function. And we also need to provide data right here. And now it's possible to just define the field that we want to override. Since we only have one field, it's not really too hard. we're going to say message, updated message for now. So let's hard code this text. And since we're using await right here, this needs to be an asynchronous function. We're going to save this one. And now once I press handle update, so let me first add a post. And as you can see, we're not seeing the result. And the reason for this is that right here when updating, we are only writing into the database. But since we're not immediately fetching again, we're not seeing the post. But obviously it would be not really efficient to fetch the database every time we add a document. So we can also just update the UI for now and only fetch when the user reloads the page. How can we add a document? We can just say that we want to set posts. We're getting the previous posts. We're going to return an array. We're going to spread the previous posts. So we're going to add all of the previous posts right here. But we're going to append a new post, which is going to be equal to an object. This object should have the same structure as all of the other posts. So we should have an ID, which can be equal to math.random, for example. So we're just creating a random number for the ID. And the message is going to be equal to the message that we've entered right here. So message, message. And again, we can just use this short form syntax like so. So now if I'm going to add, you can see that we're getting this new post right here. Let me reload. So this here's the message, this is the delete button, this is the update value button, and this is the update field. And obviously this looks absolutely terrible, but this is a new post. And I think you get the idea. We can now add a post. This only updates the user interface. We are not fetching again, but we're also updating within the database. So as you can see, we're adding all of those posts that have a message, and they all have this document name, which is going to be equal to the document ID. Once adding this post, we're also updating the user interface right here. And now let's test to update a value. So let's say updated value for this field. I'm going to update. We're having updated message right here. So at the moment, we're hard coding this updated message right here. And now, of course, I could use a state to get the value for this input field right here and store it inside of a state. So let's do this one, but there's also going to be a problem with that. But let me first show you what the problem is so you really understand. We're having const updated message set updated message, which is going to be equal to use state. We're going to initialize with an empty string like so. And now for this input field, we say that our value is going to be equal to updated message, and on change, it's going to get this event set updated message. It's going to be equal to e.target.value. So this is just normal state handling at this point. But if I'm now going to write something into this field, you can see that every single field right here changes. And why is that? We are just rendering this input instead of this map function over and over again. But every single input, so every single update field, will be bound to the exact same state right here. So to this update message state. And of course, we now only have one single state for 3 input fields, and this is going to be a problem. So how could we solve this? We could solve this problem by creating a component right here that creates one state for every single post. So let's create a new component. Let's make this pretty simple and just create it right here. We're going to say input.jsx. Const input is going to be equal to this function right here, and we're going to export default input. Inside of this input field, we're going to return, or inside of this input component, we're just going to return our input like so. And now we want to use this input right here. So let's import input from source/input. We're going to end the statement like so. And now you can see that we're getting a lot of stuff that we do not have at this point. So for example, the updated message is missing. So we want to move the state over there to this input component like so. We also need to import useState. So now this here seems to work again. And as you can see, now every input works separately, but we have a new problem. And the new problem now is that if we take a look at this app.jsx, that there is no way that we can get our message within this handle update function. So what we can just do is we can just take this function, copy it, delete it from the app.jsx and move it over to our input.jsx, because right here we have access to our updated message and we need our updated message right here to set the message. So we need to say message is going to be equal to update message. Of course, we need to update doc. So we need to re-import that one from Firebase, as well as doc right here, and as well as db. So we need to re-import all of those things within this file. So now we have this handle update method that now also has access to our updated message because it's in the same file. But now we're having the next problem. And the problem is that this click method right here, so this button that will call this method, is one level higher. It's essentially in the parent component to this input field. And we defined this handle update function within this input field. And obviously we cannot get access to handle update right here. So one thing that you could do is you could just take this button right here and pass it over to this input right here. So now let's just render this within a div, for example. And now we'll paste the button right below. And as you can see, this right here seems to work. The only problem is that we now do not have post.id. But we can fix that by just saying that this input is going to accept a post ID that is going to be equal to post.id, like so. Let's save that one. And now we need to accept this ID. We can destructure our post ID that we passed via props right here within this input component. And now we're going to pass this post ID right here as an ID. And now we can use the same post ID. So let me show you that this works. Let's change the text of "but this is a new post" to whoopee whoppy update. Let's take a look at Firebase. And we're getting whoopee whoppy. So this now seems to work. And I also want to make sure that you understand that this here is probably not the cleanest way. So now I just passed everything to this input field, but a probably better way would be to create a subcomponent that, for example, includes our input and our button. And inside of this subcomponent, which now has the name input, which is obviously also a suboptimal name because it's not really descriptive, you could then render the input component and you could render the button component. So you could create two more components if you wanted to do that. And then just define everything right here. So define handle update right here and define the state right here. And then just keep passing the function, for example, as well as updated message and set updated message via props to the individual components. So by doing so, you could keep splitting your code into separate components, which would make everything a little more clean. But I really hope you get the idea. Let's understand how register, login, and logout works within Firebase. Right now we're having this app.jsx. And let's imagine this right here is going to be our homepage. But we only want to allow a user to enter this homepage if the user is logged in. So we also need a page where the user can register and a page where the user can log in. So let's create a register.jsx file. And right here we are just going to export a basic register component that will return a normal div for now. So export default register. Now we can just copy that code and do the same for the login.jsx file. Let's paste that in, and this here is going to have the name login, and we're going to export login, like so. So this is going to be login, and this is going to be register, like so. Now, of course, we need to give the user the opportunity to get to the register, login, and homepage by using routes. So instead of our main.jsx, let's create a router. In order to use the router, again, we have to use npm I react router DOM if we have not done that yet. Install React Router DOM and implement routing. If you've done this already, then of course you don't have to do this. So now that we've installed React Router DOM, we can create the router, which is going to be equal to create browser router from React Router DOM. So we need to import that one right here. This is going to be a function provided by the React Router DOM team. This accepts an array, and inside of this array, we can now define all of the routes that we want to provide. So let's say we have a home page that we can access by using our normal URL. So that's what the slash essentially says. As an element, we want to use our app, like so. Now the second route is going to have the path /register, which is going to display our register page that we have to import from register.jsx. And now we should also add the login page by saying /login. So this is going to be the path, and the element is going to be login, like so. So now, of course, we also need to provide this router. So we need to use the router provider, like so. This can be a self-closing tag. And for the router, we are going to pass our router that we defined right here. So now if we just load the URL, we are displaying the home page. If we go to /register, we will get to the register page. And if we go to /login, we will display the login page. Now let's create the register page first of all, and let's keep this pretty minimalistic because we just want to understand how Firebase works and not how CSS works. So we're going to have an input of type email. Name can be email, ID can be email, placeholder can be email. And now if we want to register within Firebase, we need to use an email and a password at least. But a username would be pretty good if we want to display the username later on. So we can say input, text, name is going to be username, ID is going to be username, placeholder is going to be username. And now we also need a password, so input of type password, name password, ID password, placeholder password, like so. So let's save that one. And the last thing that is missing is essentially a button to submit this form. So we're going to create a button that says register, for example. So if we're going to go to /register right now, you can see that we are having this minimalistic register form right here. But we also need to give the user the opportunity to enter those values and to keep track of them. So in order to do that, we need a state for every single input field. So const email, set email is going to be equal to useState. We're going to initialize with an empty string. Const username, set username is going to be equal to useState, like so. And const password, set password is going to be equal to useState, and we're just going to initialize with an empty string, like so. So now we need to connect all of our inputs to those values. So we can say value is going to be equal to email, value is going to be equal to username, and for password, the value is going to be equal to password. Now we need to have this onChange function that is going to get the event, and we're going to set the password to e.target.value, like so. So let's just copy this onChange function and paste it in for the username. But here we need to say set username instead of set password. And same, of course, goes for the email, but here we need to say set email instead of set username. So now we're storing all of those values within our state. Now we also need to handle register. So let's create a function that says const handle register. And that one is going to be equal to this empty function for now. And once we click, we want to register the user. So once we click, we want to execute this function right here. So within our button, we say onClick is going to be equal to handle register. And now to register a user, when using Firebase, we want to use authentication. At the moment, we only have Firestore database, but we also want to get Firebase authentication. So we want to go to this tab right here. Now we want to get started. And right here, you can add a sign-in method. And we are going to try to sign in our users with an email and a password. You can also sign in with Google, Facebook, play games, and so on. So you can use all kind of things. And they all vary slightly, but also work pretty similar in a way. So let's click email and password. And right here, we just have to enable this one right here. We can also enable passwordless sign-in, but I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to save this one. And it's as easy as that to really activate that one. If you want to add a new provider, you can also do that. So now you could also get another provider, but for me, this is fine. So now if we want to use authentication within Firebase, we of course have to go to our firebase.js and we have to create an auth object. So again, export const auth. This is going to be the variable where we store our auth object, and this is going to be equal to get auth. We don't have this function yet. Firebase also provides that one, so we have to import get auth, like so, from firebase/auth. And now we can use get auth right here. We have to pass the app object, and this will initialize this auth object that we always have to use later on when we want to connect to our authentication service. So we're going to export this one so we can use it instead of another file. That's actually all we have to do to really set up auth right here, so authentication. And now creating a user, again, is something where we call our database. So there can, of course, always occur an error. So we need to do try catch. If we get an error, we are just going to console.log this error. But if we do not get an error, then we want to create a user. And Firebase provides a method right here for us that we can just use. And that one is going to be create user with email and password. And as you can see, we can import that one from Firebase/auth. So from that package, we need to use opening and closing brackets. And we need to await this one because we are calling a database. This, of course, is asynchronous. So we need to say this is going to be an asynchronous function. But as you can see, we did not import that one. So I'm going to import that one, create user with email and password from Firebase auth. But as you can see, it did not automatically import that one for me. So I have to import create user with email and password from firebase.auth. So I have to manually import it this time for whatever reason. And now you can see that we need to pass a couple of arguments in there. The first one is our auth object, so it can connect to our authentication service. So auth is going to be added right here. I also need to import that one. So import auth from /. And actually I gotta say that I want to move this file into my source folder as well as the login file. I don't know why I created it there. So now it should work. And now I want to import auth from /Firebase. So from this file right here. And I also, as you can see, need to pass my email as a second argument and the password, as you can see, as the third argument. So password right here. And this function is going to return something. So const user doc is going to be equal to await. And let me just console.log this user doc so you really understand what is going on right here. So console.log user doc like so. And once we now click register, we are calling this register function, creating a user with an email and a password by using email and password. So let's test that one. Let's go to inspect. So we are going to see what is going on. So we're going to enter easy@gmail.com, for example, as an email. Username does not matter at this point. And for the password, let's use easy, for example. Let's register. So this is the status code 400. So this was a bad request. So probably the password was a little bit too easy. I'm going to register. And as you can see now, we have those user credentials. So this time it worked, which we can also see because now we have this user right here within Firebase. So this here is going to be the user ID, this is going to be the email, and we cannot see the password obviously, because Firebase handles all of that for us under the hood. So now we get this response right here that includes our user. So we can also access the user now by going to our register page and saying that we want to log our user doc.user, for example. So let's console.log that one. Let's try to generate another user. So we're going to press register. And as you can see, now we're getting this user, which now also includes this user ID. So we can get the ID, so the user ID that we created right here by saying userdoc.user.uid, for example. And that is something that is really important because we will need that one in a second. And actually all that we really need right now is this user ID. So right now you can see that we registered all of the users. So we have those users instead of our authentication service. And this is important for logging in and registering. But of course, right now we only stored the email and we do not have access to the username, for example. And maybe we want to link a lot of data to our user. So maybe a created ad date, a username, maybe an address, maybe a bicep size, and so on. So it doesn't really matter. We can store all of this, but we cannot store all of this instead of our authentication service. So this here is only for authentication. This is for registering the user, logging the user in, logging the user out, and always having track of the user. So which user is currently logged in? Is it the user with this ID, or with this ID, for example? So that is the purpose of authentication. If we want to store additional data to our user, we should store it within our database. So right here. Maybe instead of the users collection, for example. Obviously, the name is up to us, but users is pretty common. So how can we do that? And how can we link our authentication service to our database? If you think about it, I told you about the setDoc function previously that allows you to set a specific ID for a document. And now we have this user ID right here. So now we could, for example, say that we are going to create a user within our database that is, for example, going to have this exact same user ID. So this document ID could now have the ID of our user, for example, for the individual user. And by doing so, we would now link the user that we're getting when authenticating because we are getting the user ID. And now we can link our authentication service to our database by linking this user ID that we're getting right here to the document ID that we're storing within our database. And this sounds a little more complicated than it is in reality. So let me show you. All we are really going to do is, again, we're going to create a useRef that is going to be a reference to the place where we are going to store our user. So this is going to be a doc because we want to define a specific document where we want to store our user. So a specific location where we want to store our user. We have to import that one from Firebase, Firestore this time, because we want to store inside of the database. We also need to import our DB reference that we previously defined like so. In which collection do we want to store? We want to store inside of our users collection. So users is going to be the collection name. And now we need to define an ID that we want to use for our document. So the document name right here. What is the ID? The ID can, for example, be userdoc.user uid, which is going to be this ID that we're getting right here within our authentication service. So let's save that one. And now we're going to add a document to this collection by saying await setDoc, because this time we want to set the ID because we are defining the specific ID of the document right here. And as I already mentioned previously, you use addDoc if you want Firebase to set the ID automatically, so automatically generate the ID, and you want to use setDoc if you want to define the ID yourself. And in this case, we want to define the ID ourselves because we want to link authentication to our database. And all we really have to do right now is use the useRef right here to reference the location where we want to store the data. And we need to add the data right here. What kind of data do we probably want to store? Maybe our email. So email is going to be to this email state that we have right here. And again, if key and value are the same, we can only use the key. And we also want to store the username. And now we could, for example, also store created _@. Name is up to us, of course. And Firebase gives us the server timestamp method right here from Firebase /firestore that we can import to just automatically generate a timestamp for the time of creation. And let's see whether this right here works. So I'm again going to use easy3, username is going to be easy, and password. Now let's register. So now we have easy3@gmail.com right here. So this worked. And inside of our Firestore database, let's go to users. We also have the second user right here. And you can see we have the creation date, we have our email, and we have our username. And if you think about the document name that we have right here, just remember the first letters. Let's go to authentication. And as you can see, this here is the exact same document name that we have right here for our user UID. And now, of course, after registration, you could say that you want to navigate to a different page. So you could use the useNavigate hook right here. So const navigate is going to be equal to useNavigate, which is going to return a function. And now we can just use this function right here after we set our document. And we can say we want to navigate to /, for example, so to our home page. Let's try that again. Let's create a new user with a random password and a random username. Let's press register. And as you can see, we're getting redirected to our homepage. So this seems to work. Now, if we're on the homepage, of course, we also always want to track the authentication status. So we want to check whether a user is currently logged in or not. And we have a pretty simple function for that inside of Firebase. So let me show you that one as well. First of all, where do we need our user? Where do we want to have access to our user? Do we only need access inside of our login page? Only inside of our register page? Only inside of our home page, so app.jsx? To be fair, in most apps, you will need access within your entire project. Because, for example, some routes are protected, so you only want to have access to the register and login page, for example, if you are not currently logged in, because otherwise it would not really make sense. And you only want to have access to the home page if you are currently logged in. So depending on your login status, you want to have access to certain pages and prevent access to other pages. So we want to enable access to our user within the entire app. And we can do that by using the context again and providing this context within the entire app. So let's first of all create an auth context, for example. So auth context.jsx. We are first going to create this context, so export, because we need this context later on, const auth context, which is going to be equal to create context, which we have to import from React. And now, of course, we also need to provide this context. So we need to create a component that will act as a provider. So const auth provider is going to be equal to this component function, and we're going to export default auth provider. So we'll export this auth provider as a default export. We're going to return something. What are we going to return? We're going to return the auth context.provider, like so. Instead of this provider, we are just going to render our children, which we have to accept when creating this component, like so. So let's save that one. And now our provider expects the value property where we have to pass a value. So we're first of all switching to JavaScript syntax. And instead of this value, we can now pretty much pass anything, but it might make sense to pass an object. So this object right here can, for example, have things like username, colon, and then we can just pass the username in here. But for now, let's keep this empty because we're not having anything at this point. So to get something, it might make sense to call our database and check whether the user is currently logged in. And that is something that Firebase makes super easy for us. We can just use useEffect right here. So when first loading this auth provider, we are calling this useEffect hook. This useEffect hook should check whether, or should add a listener to our document to check whether the user is currently logged in or not. And this listener will always update the user status once the user status changes. And we're just going to pass a callback function right here. We're going to have an empty dependencies array for now. And let's say we want to have const auth listener. So this one is going to be our auth listener. So this is just going to be a variable that will hold the value. And this one is going to be equal to a Firebase function. And this Firebase function is going to return the listener to us. What is the name of this function? It's on auth state changed. And as you can see, we can import that one from Firebase /auth. So we're importing that one. This one is going to return the listener. And as you can see, this one expects a couple of arguments as well. The first one is again our auth object that allows us to connect to our authentication service. And right here as a second argument, you can see that we're getting the next OR observer. And this right here gives us the current user, so the logged in user, if the user is currently logged in. So we can just say, give me the current user. This name can be anything you like, but it's always going to store the current user if the current user is there. We're going to pass a callback function right here. And for now, let's just console.log the current user like so. And for now, let's just use this auth provider and wrap our entire app with the auth provider. So instead of our main.jsx, we're going to wrap the entire router provider, which includes all of our routes, with our auth provider like so. We need an opening and closing tag. And instead of this opening and closing tag, we need to include this router provider so the entire app gets access to the auth provider. Let's save that one. Let's inspect, go to console. And as you can see, we're getting this user impl right here. And this one also has this UID, for example, of the current user that is currently logged in. So now we can, for example, check if we have a current user. If we have a current user, then we want to do something else. We want to do something else. So maybe it might make sense to provide the user data for the entire app if the user is currently logged in, and otherwise the user is going to be null. So we can check whether the user is null in every other route, so in every other component of the app if we need to. If the user is null, then the user is obviously not logged in. If there exists a user object, then the user is logged in. So we can say const user set user, which is going to be equal to use state. And again, by default, this is going to be null. So if the user is not logged in currently, the user variable will be null. If the user is logged in though, for now, let's just console.log the current user.uid to show you that this really works. And else, so if there's no current user, we again have to set user to null. Again, let's go to this page. And as you can see, we're getting the current user ID. And now we can use this user ID, as you can see, that we're getting from our authentication service. So from this service right here, to fetch all of the data that we stored inside of our users collection for the user. So we can just get all of this data right here. Why is that possible? Because the document name, as you can see right here, is equal to the user ID that we stored. And that is the benefit of using the UID from our authentication service as a document ID within our database. So now let's fetch the document and all of the data that corresponds to this user ID of the user who is currently logged in. So we're going to say const user is going to be equal to a wait. We want to get one single document, so we say get doc. What kind of document do we want? We need to define a reference right here. So we're going to say const useRef is going to be equal to a document. This document is inside of our database, so we need to say db right here. Path is going to be equal to users because this document is inside of our users collection, and document name, as mentioned, is equal to our user ID that we're getting from Firebase authentication, so equal to this one. Now, as you can see, we're already getting this warning right here. The reason for this is that this is an asynchronous function because we're awaiting the document fetch. So we need to use async right here. And now I need to pass the useRef to this get document call right here. So let's save that one. And now we can just console.log our user for now, like so. So let's check that one in here. Let me reload. And you can see that we are getting this document snapshot right here that includes our current user. How can we get the data right now? We can get the data by using user.data. So calling this method right here on the user object. And now you can see that we're getting this data for the current user. Email, username, and created ad field right here. Now is there also a way to get the ID somehow? And obviously there is. We can just pass this one here as an object. We can destructure the properties that we get, and we can add the ID right here by saying user.id, for example, or we can also just access current user.uid. That doesn't really matter because that is the exact same. So now you can see that we're getting the ID right here, as well as username, email, and credit at field. And now we can just pass this user data to this value property right here after we set our user state. So now instead of console.logging this, we can just set our user to this user object right here. And now we can just pass this user right here as a value to the rest of our app. And now our entire app should have access to this user right here that we pass as a value to the provider. Now let me, for example, try to get within our app our user. So now let's say I want to render the username within this div. So I can get access to the user by saying const. I'm going to destructure the user because we pass it as an object. It's going to be equal to useContext. Which kind of context do I want to access? I want to access the auth context because that is the context that we exported right here. And now I'm just going to access user.email, for example. So we're displaying the email. And let me also console.log the user right here so you really see that this is the exact same object, like so. And as you can see, we're getting this right here. So this is the object that we're logging. And right here, we are having our email, as you can see. So now it would be pretty easy to just obviously output our email, for example, output our username, and so on. So all of this is now pretty possible and pretty simple as well. But as you can see at this point, even though we are currently logged in, we can access our /register page, which of course does not really make too much sense because it should not be possible to access the register page if the user is currently logged in. So we could create a protected route. So let's say public route.jsx. Why public route? Because this here is going to be a public route that every user that is not logged in can access. So it's essentially public. So now we're just going to create a const public route, so a normal component that's going to be equal to this arrow function right here. And we're going to export default public route like so. And inside of this public route, we now need access to this authentication status. So whether the user is logged in or not. We can again get access by accessing the context. So our user, which is equal to useContext of the auth context. And now we're just going to return a div right here, for example, doesn't really matter. And inside of this div, we're just going to return the children. And you will understand this in a second. Right here, we're going to extract children as a prop. So right here, we're getting children. And inside of this div, we're just going to render the children. So this right now would just act as a wrapper though. So this is not really too useful. In our case, we want to display the children if the user is not logged in. So our register or login page, for example, should be displayed right here if the user is not logged in. If the user is logged in though, then we want to redirect to the home page, for example. How can we do that? This is actually pretty simple. We can switch to JavaScript syntax. We can check whether the user exists. If we have a user, then we want to redirect the user immediately. And we can use the navigate component right here from React Router.dom to immediately redirect the user if the user exists. So we are going to load navigate right here. This is going to go to to our home page. And if we do not have a user, so if the user is not logged in, then we're just going to output our children right here. And now let's use this public route within our router. So this is how this works. We're just going to wrap this register route within our public route like so. This is going to wrap our register route like so. And as you can see, now if we have a user, then we're going to redirect. If we do not have a user, then we're going to render the children. The children in this case is this register route. And now if we're going to try to access register, you can see that we're immediately getting redirected to this page right here. Now let's also create a protected route. So protected route.jsx const protected route is going to be equal to a normal component again. Export default protected route. So we're exporting this route. And now the logic is pretty much the exact opposite. So again, we're getting the user. So const user is going to be equal to useContext. We are going to get the auth context. We're going to return a div. Instead of this div, we again switch to JavaScript syntax. We're checking whether we have a user. If in this case we have a user, then everything is fine. Then we should just render the children. So we have to accept children as a prop right here. And we have to return children right here if we have a user. Otherwise, we are again going to use navigate to redirect the user once he loads this component, like so. And we're going to go to /register, for example, like so. You can first of all see that we're getting this error. So let's fix this error right now. Within our app.jsx, the reason we're getting this error is because the user initially does not exist. So we first need to say that you should only access this email if the user exists, like so. So now this error should be gone. And as you can see, it is. But now we should also use the protected route within our main.jsx, because that is something that I did not do yet. So app will be within the protected route, like so. And also our login page should be within our public route, like so. So now everything should work. If we are going to access this page, it works because our user is currently logged in. If we go to our register page, it works because our user is currently logged in. If we go to our login page, it works because our user is currently logged in. Now let's also create a button to log the user out. So within our app.jsx, let's create a button that says logout, and on click we want to execute handle logout, for example. And logging out is really simple within Firebase. We're just going to define a function const handle logout, like so. It's going to be a normal arrow function right here. You can of course also use a normal function. And now I'm going to say await sign out. We have to import that one from Firebase auth, like so. As you can see, this only needs the auth instant, so we just have to pass auth right here. And now this here needs to be async, of course, because we have to wait the sign out. Let's save that one. Let me log out, and as you can see, we're getting redirected to the register page. If I'm now trying to get access to the home page, so by using this route, you can see we're immediately getting redirected to the register page, because that has been the functionality that we implemented within our protected route right here. So we're redirecting to /register if the user does not exist. And of course, you can again have this within a try catch block, like so. And we're going to log the error. Now let's access our login page. And now let's also implement login. So within our login page, we pretty much have to do the same we did within our register page. So we just need an input of type email, like so. Name is going to be email, placeholder email. Now we also need a password. Name is password, ID is password, placeholder is password. And that's actually enough. We don't need a username. The username is already defined within our database. Now let's have a button that says login, for example. And we need to create a state. So const email set email is equal to use state. Const password set password is equal to use state. And we're going to initialize both values with an empty string. Now the value for email is going to be email. On change, e goes to set email, e.target.value. And for our password, our value is equal to our password. And on change, we're getting this event set password to e.target.value. So now those listeners right here should work. We should get those values. And now all we need to do is we need to call a function on click. So when clicking this login button. And this function is going to have the name handle login. We need to define this function, of course. So const handle login is going to be equal to an asynchronous function, because of course we are calling the database later on. So this here should be asynchronous. Let's immediately create a try catch block, because I think you saw this pretty often right now. So this should be pretty intuitive. And now we just need to await sign in with email and password. So we need to import that one from Firebase auth. We're going to pass our auth object right here that we need to import, as well as our email and our password. Let me first of all create a user that I can actually remember. So let's go to register. best1@gmail.com, best1. So I hope I can remember that one. Let's register. We're getting redirected. Let's log out. Works. Let's go to /login. Let's use best1@gmail.com. best1 as a password. Let's log in. We're getting redirected to this page. So the login works as well. One thing that we should do in the end is unmounting this listener. And this right here is just best practice. And you can unmount the listener by saying return, followed by the name of the listener. In our case, it's auth listener. But you will see pretty often that this right here has the name unsubscribe, like so. And then you're just going to return unsubscribe. So what does this line right here say? By default, you only need one single listener, because one single listener will be enough to listen to all of the changes. If you don't unsubscribe from this listener, every time this component will get re-rendered, we are going to create another listener. So we're going to start with one listener, then we're going to create a second one, a third one, a fourth one, and so on, even though we only need a single listener, because a single listener, again, is enough to listen to all of the changes. And in this case, it might not make too much sense, because the auth provider wraps our entire app, so the auth provider component will only be rendered once when we load the app. But if you think about a profile page, for example, and you, for example, have the listener on a profile page, then you would create a new listener every time you go to the profiles page. And that, of course, is suboptimal. So it's always best practice to unmount a listener when you use useEffect.